All right, guys, listen, I am pleased to announce that we are going to be addressing finally some Wes Huf propaganda on biblical slavery. And I'm joined today by actual experts, scholars in the field, Dr. Kip Davis and Dr. Joshua Bowen. Dr. Kip is a Dead Sea Scrolls expert, and Dr. Josh is an Assyriologist. And I would say maybe right now is maybe the most popular expert on the topic of slavery in the Bible. And I know that's not the thing you want to be known for, but
you know,
that is the thing you are known for.
How popular can you be when you're popular for talking about slavery?
Just not a topic I thought I'd have to deal with more than once.
I just wanted to point out I'm specially qualified because not only am I a biblical scholar, but I am also a born and bred, true blood, authentic Canadian. So, and I'm sorry to the world for David Falk. Oh wait, Wes Huf. Sorry, there's two of them.
Freudian slip there.
So for those who don't know, Wes Huf and Apologetics Canada released a video kind of explaining biblical slavery, and for some reason failed to read like a single passage in the Bible about slavery. So we're going to be, I mean, just as long as you ignore the passages, it's going to be okay.
Just remember, we've got guys, the video. Just remember, hot tikva, right? I love you.
Hot tikva, everyone.
Well, we've got the video loaded up. Let me throw it on the stage. And for everyone who's watching, we sped up the Wes Huf video because it's like an hour long. And we didn't want to spend a 3-hour live stream addressing the claims. So it's going to be a little bit quick. So all this is going to be recorded on YouTube. You can go back and listen to it later. If there was something that maybe you missed, he was talking too fast, it'll be preserved for future record. All right, let's get it rolling.
There's this great quote from the professor of theology and society at the University of South Wales, Rowan Williams, and he says if the abolition of slavery had been left to the Enlightenment secularists of the 18th century, we would still be waiting. Ooh. And I think that's what you're getting to there, Troy, is why is that? Well, because let this sink in. Every movement of abolition of slavery within history has been a Judeo-Christian inspired movement.
Yeah. In the
so strong start, eh?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to let Josh go on this, but am I the only person who needs to point out here that at the time that slavery, that the abolitionist movements were getting going, the entire Western world was a Christian world? Like, where are all these secularists or atheists or whatever that Wes Huf and his Canuckian friends think we're out there failing to, do anything about this? Where are those guys?
Right. Well, go ahead.
I just want to say, like this seems to be a pretty common apologetic tactic, right? It's this. I don't think it's a Mott and Bailey, but I feel like it's in the same genre, where the question that's supposed to be being dealt with is, did like the Hebrew Bible or did the Bible or something endorse or condone slavery? Not what did people do with it 2,000 years later? Those are separate questions. And I feel like when you start off with this, like, well, who are the people that got science going, or who are the people that abolished slavery? This is to not deal with the issue at hand. So, I mean, again, if you're only trying to say, how did people later interpret a text and then utilize it, that's a separate question. But if we're trying to say, what is it that the law says in the Hebrew Bible, you don't start off with, yeah, well, look what people did with it in the 20th century. Or the 19th century.
It's a misdirection. He's starting the video with a misdirection. Is don't look here, look over there. We're not so bad because these other non-Christians got it wrong too. But the opening statement's just not true to begin with, because there's a number of non-religious abolitionists from America and from
Oh, there they are.
UK.
Thank you.
It's almost like
Thanks,
these
Frank.
people existed. We got a whole list of them, and these are just some that I was able to document on the ready. There's actually a bunch of them that were public, writing in newspapers, writing articles, and in journals. So this idea that like non-Christian or non-religious abolitionists were just slow, they were behind the Christians, is just actually not a true statement. So that being said, let's go into a little more of the video here.
Question is, does the Old Testament endorse slavery?
Yeah, that's a question that we hear a lot, and honestly, it's a complicated question. So I would say no, and I would say yes, and it depends upon how you're looking at that question. This is something that I've given a lot of thought to. I know, Wes, you have as well, and Troy, and so I'm actually really looking forward to talking about this today and doing our very best to keep it as brief as possible, because I mean, this is a monster topic and could really take a lot to get into the depths of it. But we're going to do our best with the time that we have.
I guess, obviously, we've answered the big overarching question, but I wonder if like one of the best places to start would be to almost try and better explain slavery from Old Testament point of view versus how we may know it, through, what we know of African slavery and that kind of thing. And was there a difference? Because there's been debates as to whether or not it was the same, or was that more of like they were an employee, that kind of thing?
I would absolutely say that these are different things. What's happening with regards to slavery in the Old Testament and what happened with transatlantic slaves in antebellum South, that is a unique situation, and we're not going to be able to get into that part of it. But
So they started out, first of all, by not addressing what the Bible says, because we don't want to actually read the Bible. But they go into a comparison of slavery and the antebellum South and explain how somehow they're different, but how different are they really?
And they're not being in any way precise as to how they're comparing them.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not saying, all right, we're going to compare modern understandings of the atrocities that took place and what you as a person in the 21st century associate with the word slavery and the laws in the Hebrew Bible, right? That they're not even being precise about that. Nope. Which would be, I think, an unfair comparison, unless you're doing it specifically for lexical purposes, right? In the same way that if we come across the Hebrew word uga and we translate that as cake in English, you might want to say to your Hebrew student in your class, hey, when we say cake, it's not really the same thing. If that's the only reason that you're doing it, is to say, look, when you think of slavery, what do you think of? People have no rights. People can be mercilessly killed. Anything can be done to them because they have no rights. That's not what's going on in the Hebrew Bible. Fine. But I mean, you're just talking about the laws in the Hebrew Bible. And then if you're going to do that, then you should be looking at the laws in the antebellum South. And that's just not what they do.
I mean, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, another way to look at this, another analogy we can draw is that the Hebrew word hatikva now means the hope. But if you go far enough back into the biblical text, I'm just kidding. It just means the hope. That's it. That's all it means. Sorry.
But it can be broken into three different words.
Yeah, it can.
And then tik, and then va.
And va. Yes.
Important. Break that up.
Very important breakdown.
All right, Justin, parse them.
There's some highbrow inside dialogue happening now.
I'm sorry. Everybody just needs to watch my channel. That's all.
Listen, I watch it. If you guys aren't subscribed already to Dr. Kip Davis or Dr. Joshua Bowen, you're really missing out. You're not doing YouTube correctly.
You're not.
That being said, so the first thing he does is a misdirect. The second thing they do in the video is they say, well, it's not as bad as X, which is a red herring. So for example, like if Jim Bob is, abusing his wife and he says, yes, but I'm not abusing my wife the same way Joe Bob is. Well, it doesn't matter if you're not doing it as bad as Joe Bob. You're still abusing your wife. So again, this is a misdirection. Say, don't look at what's actually happening. Look at this other thing over here.
Yeah, Justin, I really think this would be akin to something like if someone is on trial for having, gone on a killing spree, right? And they used a gun to do that. The defense attorney standing up and saying, well, when you listen, people are throwing around the term serial killer, right? And let's just get this out of the way right now. My client is no Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right.
I mean, he killed those 30 people with a gun. I mean, look, very, very different. Your Honor, right? Like sick flex, I guess is what I would say. Like,
I'm pretty sure that's how every murder trial starts. I'm no expert, but I think that's how they do it, isn't it?
We'll see. Well, let's see what they have to say, because they're going to do a little more hand waving here and not so much like actual reading from the Bible. But we're going to read the Bible for them tonight. We're not going to let them get out of it.
We're always doing this, aren't we, Josh? We're always reading the Bible to the apologist. It feels like this is
because we hate it so much.
I just hate it. Yeah, just out
the historian
out to get it.
Give us a little snapshot, Wes, of what slavery would have looked like in the.
Yeah, can we just pause it there for a second? Is Wes a historian?
No. In fact, Wes hasn't even completed his PhD yet, and he's studying the New Testament, if I remember correctly. He doesn't study the ancient Near East.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he doesn't even, like, when I watched his video, who was he with? Joe Rogan. He was talking about the Hebrew text, and he didn't even know what the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia was. He just flubbed it. The first, and I don't even have a PhD. If you don't know how to pronounce the name of this text, what are you doing?
That's because he's into Quentin, man.
I think.
Come on. That's what it is. It's like
he's into
PHS is so far gone. Yeah. That's in the past. Quinta, baby.
But listen, I don't have money for the Quinta, but one day, I have a goal of getting to that point. But the fact of the matter remains, we have this really weird thing in like apologetics where we'll take anybody who is some kind of a biblical scholar and we'll say their opinion is fact because they're a biblical scholar. But that's why we have specialists. Like, we have specialists who study the ancient Near East and do just that. And Wes is not that. He's not a historian. He hasn't studied the ancient Near East. He's studying New Testament manuscripts.
And the fact that he appeals in places to Paul Copan, right, as a source, like, is telling to me.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky question because even if you look at something like the Bible and look at the word that's translated as slave, depending on your Bible translation, it may very well use the same word, right, that can be translated as slave, but may say something like servant or bondservant or bondslave. And that's where this gets tricky, because there
we do that too, don't we?
Mm-hmm. It's called lexicography.
Words have semantic ranges,
right?
Which is why context is so important when looking at these things within the biblical text. And I would also, I continue to challenge people in this. I challenge myself in my own work on the biblical text, where when I do see words, like when I see a word like eved, which is the Hebrew word for slave, when I do see it used in context, like you'll see it often, the kings will make, pronouncements or send messages to other rulers and announce themselves as your eved, right? And we translate that usually as your servant, legitimately so, because that's kind of the relationship that they're implying here. But I have to continually remind myself also, I think we all should, that the ways in which we break down the differences in the semantic range of some of these individual Hebrew words is not even necessarily the same way they did. So conceptually speaking, a word like eved, where it most of the time just means slave. There is always an element of that, I'm convinced, carried forward in every usage of the term.
Yeah, and the other thing too is I think what Wes is attempting to do is saying, well, because the semantic range of Evid could land you on a bondservant, then that means we should be charitable. Every time we see the word slave, we should assume that it's not chattel slavery because the word has that semantic range. But as you already point out, it's the context of the passage that tells you how to use this particular word. And as we'll see in Leviticus 25, it's clearly talking about someone who is a chattel slave. The semantic range is in use.
And is our ancient Near Eastern historian expert, Wes, going to do that with the Akkadian Wardum? Right? Is he going to do that with the Sumerian terms, Arad, and like is he going to do that across the board and take a charitable approach every time that he sees it there? That it's a servant, and why not? If not, why not?
Right. And they're going to be very selective. And they do this. This is very common where a Christian will talk about the slavery that the Hebrew people were in Egypt. That was slavery. But the slavery that they put other people in, that wasn't real slavery. So like when it suits their particular interpretation, they're going to use the semantic range of the word that is most comfortable to how they want it to be interpreted, not to what it actually is. But let's get further into the video because he's going to say a lot of things.
Debate as to how to properly render these words, both in something like the Semitic Hebrew or in other ancient Near Eastern languages like Akkadian or Aramaic, and also in the Greek word that's used in the New Testament. And so there's debate within the scholarly community. There's actually, so a friend of the ministry, Peter J. Williams, he has a lecture online where he goes through the arguments on this, whether, we should just consistently translate it as one or the other, slave or servant, depending on our context, or whether it merits going through rendering that one way or the other. And the reality is what we see within Scripture in terms of the ancient Near Eastern context is messy because you have slavery that's going on in the broader culture within the ancient world, and then you have slavery that's going on in Israel, and sometimes they're not exactly referring to the exact same.
It's not the same thing, guys. Come on.
Still waiting for some sort of evidence for that, aren't we?
Yeah, and I mean everything up to this point has just been one big truism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, hey, we should be aware of the context when we translate a word.
Okay.
Like, I feel like that's Peter Williams' whole lecture, in that
Right.
that video that he's referring to. Like, it's essentially just one big truism. Like, here's how to do lexicography.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks.
And the thing he's not going to do is actually examine the passages to demonstrate the semantic range. So here's the sleight of hand that he wants to do, right? In Exodus 21, it says, when you buy a male Hebrew slave, he's to serve you for 6 years. Well, the apologist will go in and say, yes, a slave, an Evid, is a bondservant. It's a temporary position. Of course, they forget that in Middle English, a bondservant also had a semantic range that could be chattel slavery, but that's beside the point, right? So, but what they won't do is go all the way down to Leviticus 25, where it talks about actual chattel slaves, where it says the same words, Evid and Amah, says you will acquire them or purchase them from among the aliens residing with you, from their families who are with you, who have been born in your land. They may be your property. They will be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. And you guys already know in the actual Hebrew text, I don't know why the NRSV doesn't translate it in. It says le'olam, meaning they'll be your property forever. So, but Wes wants you to believe that every time the word Evid shows up or the word Amah shows up, that it's the Exodus version where, no, this is just a temporary servant. This is not an actual chattel slave.
But that's what's so crazy about this, because can you scroll back up to Exodus 21, 2-6? Because you have chattel slaves there.
It's there,
right?
verse 4,
they're just what I keep messing up what they're called. NPCs, non-playable characters, right? It's the wife and the children.
Yes.
They're chattel, folks. And the man signs up to be a permanent slave. Like, I don't understand. I mean, I do understand why they don't see it or why they don't engage with it. But
You know,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was just going to say Josh and I read this text in our biweekly Hebrew stream last month, a couple months ago, I guess. And as my good friend, seminary professor here at Northwest Baptist Seminary, Joel Koretko, he's fond of saying that the language of the covenant code of Exodus 22 is really dense. It's pretty opaque. So there's places here just in this short text that you have highlighted. If his master gives him a woman and she bears him sons, where it says she bears him sons or daughters, is that the slave that she is bearing sons and daughters for or to? Or is that the owner? Like, the text isn't clear on this. But I think we have in our heads, right? This we've got these built-in impressions of the text from the outside without digging into the language, into what's actually going on. This really does color the ways in which we read and evaluate the text.
Sure. And to the point that that we find in verse 4 that Josh brought up is the woman who's being given as a wife, where it's not clear that it's her choice to begin with, so that makes her essentially a sex slave at this point. And then what happens if there are children that are born to this temporary Hebrew servant? At the end of the 6 years, the Hebrew servant goes free. That wife and her kids are still permanent possessions of the master. And this isn't God saying, if you do this, he's saying, listen, if you give a woman, a servant, to be a wife to another servant or slave, then she will be your permanent slave. This is a command from God to make people into slaves. And you might be like the apologists will say, like, but God, it's okay to make the foreigners slaves because that's how you bring the foreigners into the fold.
Yeah.
These are not foreigners. These are your own kinfolk.
Oh my God,
Let's,
what was it? I just had to this just reminded me. Josh and I did I think it's pretty good. A video with Apologia just before Christmas on this topic. And the apologists that we were responding to in that video, that's Dr. Carmen Imes and Sean McDowell, continued to make this, and this was a substantial part of their presentation. They continued to make this equivocation between slaves, the treatment of slaves, and the treatment of foreigners, just generally. It's a bait and switch. And then the treatment of women, right? And one of the reasons, but I think this kind of works against them if you think through this carefully, because one of the reasons they're able to do that in the first place is because from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, these categories are not like so clearly delineated from one another. Slaves, women, foreigners. And I think that should be very troubling to anyone who reads the text.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get to it as the video progresses, but they're not going to touch maybe tangentially female slaves or sex slaves or concubines. I don't know if I recall if it comes up in the video, but I think we owe it to the audience to at least mention it at some point, cover a little bit of Deuteronomy 20 and 21, and maybe even Numbers 31, and demonstrate that the women were, the idea that, you fall in love and get married and that your husband and wife isn't really a concept that we find. But let's grab this video.
As we said off the bat, that what we often think about as slavery is our mind goes to something like the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
But if you read something like Exodus 21:16, it commands the death penalty for kidnapping and selling another human being into
Okay,
servitude.
so let's just pause there. So what is the argument here? Is the argument that if it is illegal to kidnap someone in a particular, I guess here in the law collections of the Hebrew Bible, that means that they could not have slavery or the same slavery that was in the transatlantic slave trade. Is that the argument? Because if that's the case, the laws in the Hebrew Bible are not novel, right? Like you can't, laws of Hammurabi, you can't kidnap people, right? And reduce them to slavery. That's illegal. It's illegal in the laws of Ornama to do that. So does that mean that there wasn't slavery, or like what if the only point here is that there are aspects of the transatlantic slave trade that differ in points from what we see in the law collections in the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible, then fine, just make that point. But what that's, I don't think that's what they're doing. I think what they're trying to do is to demarcate completely, like anything you're thinking about as slavery, it's not that, right? There is no overlap. This isn't like a Venn diagram that has transatlantic slave trade, or antebellum slavery and slavery in the Hebrew Bible, and they overlap in some places, right? This is how it is. But what I think what they want to do is no, they're just completely separate. And argument, please.
Right. And we also know in the ancient world, there's a number of ways you can become a slave. The only way to become a slave is not somebody kidnaps you. And it seems pretty clear that in the text in Exodus, which is mirrored in Deuteronomy, that this is a Hebrew servant or a Hebrew person being turned into a slave. This is not about foreigners, because God explicitly tells you that you can do this to foreigners. You're allowed to do this to foreigners. Whoever kidnaps a person in Exodus 21:16, but then in Deuteronomy 20, you're allowed to kidnap people. When you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders you, then all the people in it shall serve you as forced labor. But if it does not accept your terms of peace and makes war against you, then you will besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you will put all of its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your plunder the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the town, all of its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies. So that's kidnapping of people. That's what it means to kidnap people and turn them into slaves.
Well,
Yeah, and I think this is where we need to, from a lexicographic standpoint, maybe from a broader interpretive standpoint, we need to keep emic and etic categories distinct when we need to do that, right? So the way that they would think about kidnapping or stealing a person, that would not translate over in their minds to Deuteronomy 20. Like that's to them in their emic categories, that's not stealing, right? That's a different thing. In the same way that they would not view Deuteronomy 21:10-14 and taking a captive bride as rape. They would not consider it that. We would. I mean, we sane people that actually have humanity. Sorry. Not sorry. Yes, we would define that as rape by our standards, by our terms. And so, but the problem is, I think there's well, you both have said it, like there's equivocation going on here. And I think that's the problem, part of the problem anyway.
Right. And we're going to see more of it, unfortunately. There's less reading of the text and explaining, and a lot more equivocating and not actually looking at the text.
So much explaining.
In that context, we cannot kind of equivocate what we're talking about when we think of taking people from sub-Saharan Africa, putting them in boats and carting them over to the New World and making them work on plantations. Yeah. That's not the same thing that's going on. In the ancient world, you have a number of different things that are happening, which does include things that could be comparative but not completely analogous, in that in warfare, captured and defeated people who were in the army of the group that was defeated would then be put into work camps, kind of thing. So you do have things that are similar, but it wouldn't be the exact same thing as what we're looking at when we're looking at, say, a plantation. Right. And then you also have people who
work camps.
What
are we talking about, Wes?
I don't know about any
are
of
those the Moss?
Yeah, well, that wouldn't be that would be. I think that would be a group that has accepted vassalage
Right.
If they haven't been conquered, you don't fight them.
Yeah.
So,
That's
I mean,
true.
Wes, what are we talking about, buddy? Like,
I don't know.
you got to be careful what you're talking about. Of course, you might want to know it first. So maybe that's the problem. I don't know.
Yeah, he's just repeating talking points that he's heard, just like any other apologist. He's not actually addressing any ancient text. Keep in mind, through this whole video, he will not be reading the Bible, and he will not be quoting a single ancient Near Eastern text on this topic. And so, but this is the way you do apology: is you talk around it, not actually focusing on it. And again, he's still equivocating. He said, "Don't equivocate." He's still equivocating, saying, "Well, it's not this other thing that you have in your mind. It's this other thing that we're not actually going to show you, because if we do show you, you're not going to like it."
Sell themselves into slavery. And we have multiple instances of both in the Old and New Testament that comment on this. Paul in the New Testament even says, don't sell yourself into slavery, right? Like, so there's almost like an economic safety net that exists. And the complexity, like I said before, is that the same word is used. The same word is used within these ancient languages to describe someone who is part of an army that's been defeated, who is then being put to work by the nation that's defeated him, and someone who, say, is in an economic state where they then sell themselves into the working in a household, and they have, say, a place to live, food to eat, their children are being taken care of by this wealthy household, and both of those individuals are referred to by the same word in the original language. So
Is that entirely accurate?
Yeah. And why is that why is that the issue?
Right.
Because sorry, Kip, I'll shut up. But
No, you go.
like, lexicography is not done by saying, okay, look, here's what it's not. Let's talk about things that it's not. Right? I mean, that can be a part of it, but at some point, you got to read the fucking text, right? You have to see what it is. So I don't understand this logic here of saying, well, this same word can be used. Yeah, the same word can be used of a petty king in the Amarna period, right? Who's writing to the pharaoh saying, hey, your servant, right? So what? I mean, like, I guess that's interesting in broad lexicographic context. Like, we're just trying to get what's the full range of this word eved or wardu. But in this case, what are we talking about? We're trying to talk about slaves proper, right? So don't sit here and talk about, well, like what is, if we're talking about what run means, like, is it appropriate to say when Joni is going to run around the block for exercise, is it appropriate to call that running, or should we call that jogging? You don't say, well, listen, run can be like, your sink has water that's running and your nose could be running. Yes, thanks. Your refrigerator could be running. Yeah, that's true. But that doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about here.
Not a thing.
it's just more complex than I think we often think it might be at face value.
Okay.
And just to highlight that, that's not to.
Oh, I wanted to mention too. They bring this up. Wes mentioned it, and other apologists are going to mention it, that slavery was a social safety net, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
the problem with that statement is it belies the fact that it's not for certain people. Like, it's
Right.
a social safety net would be indentured servitude. So, for example, Hammurabi 117, you guys already know, says if you fall into debt, you can sell yourself and you'll work for 3 years and you're free after 3 years. Exodus says you serve for 6 years and you're free after the 6th year. This could be a social safety net. We're not
Yes.
talking about that. We're talking about actual slaves that are permanently owned. They don't have the right to go where they please. They don't have the right to leave. They're not getting paid. They're getting forced to work, and they will get beaten badly if they don't do what they're told, according to Exodus 21, 20, and 21.
Correct. And I think I'm happy you pointed that out, Justin, because yes, it could be a social safety net within the ancient world, but it is clearly not in every instance. And even in places where the laws are structured in such a way to provide a veneer of safety, very often these laws are working towards the benefit of those in power at the expense of those who need the most help.
Right. And keep in mind, they had the opportunity to make a social safety net. They knew how to do it, because part of it gets described in Leviticus 25:39. If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children with them shall go out from your authority. They shall go back to their own family and return to their ancestral property, for they are my servants, my slaves, who I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but you shall fear your God. Now, God could have said, do this to the foreigners too. That's not what he said. He said, as for the male and female slaves who you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire the male and female slaves. And he explicitly says at the end of verse 46 that you can treat them harshly. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. So God does allow a safety net for some people, but harsh slavery for others. And that's what we're concerned about.
And I think it's important to point out a couple things here. First of all, that word that's translated as harshness, Josh and I will draw attention to this quite often because it's it's a rare word within the Hebrew text. And it's the same word.
Is it?
It's the same word. I think that's it. It's got to be it. But it is the same word that is used in the beginning of the book of Exodus to describe the conditions of the Hebrew slaves toiling in the house of slaves in Egypt, which is presented as a universally terrible situation for these people. So that's the first thing. The second thing here is that I think the rationale matters here. Go back to that Leviticus 25 passage.
Yeah,
so
let me put it up.
The rationale here is the rationale for where it says that the sons of Israel are not to be bought and sold as slaves. The rationale here is not some sort of view of human equity or value or any of those sorts of things. Look at what the text says here. The reason why is because you are my slaves, says Yahweh. They already belong to Yahweh, which means that they can't be sold. It's not because of some form of intrinsic value. It's because they're already bought and paid for. And, Yahweh's not just giving up on his assets. And have at the rest of the nations because he doesn't own them.
Right.
Do some sort of hermeneutic gymnastics to kind of say, oh, slavery's not that bad.
Yeah.
Slavery was bad. But you have to understand, slavery was complex, and there was different kinds of slavery that was at play, as Wes is talking about. And if we use the different categories for this, we would have things like debt slavery that Wes was talking about. This is where somebody might find themselves in debt, and they've kind of got a choice. They can either starve to death, or they can put themselves into indentured servitude sort of idea. There was no social security. There was no workers' comp in ancient times. And so, sadly, slavery was a reality that was a part of our world until fairly recently. And thankfully, that is over by and large. No, don't get me wrong. Slavery, sadly,
I would be remiss if I didn't say, like he's saying, well, there were no social safety nets. That wasn't true. There were social safety nets, but even if there wasn't, God could have made one. God is the most powerful entity in all of the universe. He could have told them, take up a tax, and when your brethren fall into poverty, make sure that they have a safety net using this tax. Like, they're putting limits on God now, saying, well, this is all he could do.
But that's what's so frustrating, I think, about this, is that it is what you see in the Hebrew Bible, the point that every seventh year, somebody can only serve for that amount of time, and then freedom is to be declared to them. Of course, that's not something that's novel to the Hebrew Bible. You have this in really ancient Near Eastern kings, Mesopotamian kings. This is what they did, right? Anduraru is they often early in their reign to sort of to bridge the gap between the very rich and the very poor. They would just declare freedom of loans and slavery and everything, all debt canceled. Look, everybody kind of goes back. And it was understood that this was to try to reinforce economic stability or to build back up economic stability. So it's not novel to the Hebrew Bible. There might have been, with something like Jubilee in Leviticus 25, at least in its ideal, what they write or what the scribe is maybe idealistically thinking should happen. And then it's set on an actual schedule so that people know. And of course, the text deals with that, right? Don't be stingy, saying, "Oh my goodness, like the 50th year is coming up, or the 7th year is coming up. What are we going to do?" So yeah, I mean, the recurring nature of it is something different. But I mean, like, if you read through, and I would encourage people to do it, go pick up a copy of Martha Roth's Law Collections from the Ancient Near East, I think is the title, and just read through the prologues of several of these Mesopotamian law collections, and you'll see that, like, the job of the king, the role of the king, is to protect the weak and the vulnerable and the orphan and the widow from the oppressor, from the more powerful. That's the point. So yeah, and last thing, Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus 25 are both predicated on the supernatural provision and blessing of Yahweh if they obey his voice. That's the whole point. So they're supposed to, with a debt slave, Deuteronomy 15, 12 to 18, when they let this debt slave go free, Israelite debt slave, they're supposed to provide generously from from what they have, with the idea that they haven't been able to do anything for themselves, benefit for themselves for the last 6 years. So here, give them a bunch of provisions so that they don't fall back into poverty. And the same thing is true in Leviticus 25, right? This is the same sort of general way of dealing with this problem. The problem from the apologist perspective, I think, though, should be to recognize that God is saying, don't worry about it. I'll bless you. I'll bless you so much, in the same way that if you let your land lie fallow every 7th year, I'll give you so much in that 6th year that you'll be eating it 3 years later. Like, so yeah, the idea that God is somehow limited just goes against the text itself in what he does in these situations.
Yeah. And to the point that you made, a lot of the ancient Near Eastern law codes, when you read like the prologue, the king is usually bragging about, I eliminated, the oppressed. I eliminated the strong overtaking the weak. I eliminated the rich oppressing the poor. The goal of these law codes were typically to eliminate a lot of the oppressed. So this idea that like the Bible was unique in some way isn't actually there. We find the same type of preamble in all the ancient Near Eastern law codes. And again, the Bible understandably, stops short anyways. The Bible doesn't eliminate the oppressed. It doesn't eliminate the slave or the poor. But let's keep listening to this bad apologetic.
Still goes on.
Mhm.
But that was your options, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I could die or I could put myself into debt slavery. Now, you also had chattel slavery that also took place, and this was very different in this regard. This is somebody that could be a slave for life, could be generationally a slave. These people were property; they were owned by the slave master. And this you find both of these in the Bible. You find debt slavery, you find chattel slavery. Going along with what Wes is saying, chattel slavery would have existed particularly out of situations of war, where they would have taken people captive. And one of the things that we see is, by and large, in ancient times, most slavery was debt slavery. The one reason why I wanted to just make this
So they say things like the Bible condoned chattel slavery, but they fail to actually read the passage. And then they said that one equivocation or their reason for chattel slavery, well, is obviously because of war. And a lot of people have this mindset, well, yeah, if you do it in war, it's okay. But first of all, he's wrong. A lot of slaves were just bought. In Leviticus 25, you went and you acquired a slave. The household of Abraham was full of many slaves that were acquired, purchased,
or born into it. You lead by it. The
Yes.
house-born slave. You see it in Ecclesiastes 2:7, as you just pointed out. Like you see it in the stories with Abraham. But I mean, you
Exodus
see it in
23.
Exodus 21, 2-6. a house-born slave is very valuable in that respect in the ancient Near Eastern context. So yeah, I mean, this is just nonsense, right? It's just either not knowing the text or just not dealing with it. I don't know.
Right. And we have laws. For example, Exodus says 6 days, the Sabbath law, a very important law. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, so that your ox, your donkey may have relief, and your home-born slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. So these are slaves born in the home. We're not told that they're taken from war, but even if they were, let's imagine their parents were taken in war. Guess what? Their children would be slaves, and then their children would be slaves. So just saying, well, there was war doesn't make it any better. And even in war in modern times, we recognize that it's not okay to make foreigners slaves. You don't have to take slaves because you're at war. This is something that God allows that we wouldn't allow today. It's still slavery. All right, let's keep listening to the bad apologetics.
Clarification between the transatlantic slave trade and what we're seeing in ancient Near East, in that slavery was more complicated. As we just mentioned, you had a difference between debt slavery and chattel slavery. By the way, you also had sex slavery. There's another category that existed.
Right.
But one thing that was particularly unique about the slave trade that happened with sub-Saharan Africans is that it was a justified.
Categories are these?
I think
Right.
he's
I mean,
yeah.
In terms of I can see making the distinction between a debt slave and a chattel slave, because from an economic perspective, this is how you make this determination. But a sex slave as compared to like a chattel slave, I think this is artificial. Certainly from the perspective of the sources, the ancient Near Eastern sources, because this is not really something that they do.
Right.
But how do you move past it like that?
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm understanding what this gentleman is saying, he's saying, yeah, we have sex slavery in the Hebrew Bible too.
Right.
Right? Did I hear that correctly?
Did he say that?
Yeah.
Is that what
That's
he said?
what he said, and then he moved on. He
And then
said
just go right on by.
Wow.
Yeah. We don't need to address it. It's there. Let's not talk about it. Let's talk about the other stuff that's more comfortable.
Like what?
Wow.
Good grief.
Like it's wild to me that there's one person on the panel that is willing to say the hard thing, but they're not willing to actually talk about the hard thing. And I don't recall if he's going to give a defense for some of the stuff he just said, but my guess is it's not going to happen.
That they were, in fact, could be enslaved because they weren't human, that they were subhuman. They were to be viewed as you would view an ox or a
Inferior.
horse.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were an animal. They were seen as an animal, and they were treated as such.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned this before, so much so that you have people like Otabanga that was taken from the Congo and put into a zoo in New York that was put on display with orangutans. Like that's literally how they saw them. Now, of course, that's not to justify it. I'm in no way trying to justify it. I'm just trying to help people to understand the difference here. Now, one thing I would say, and Wes, I'm curious your thoughts on this, is the
hold on. So, I appreciate that he's pointing out this difference, but I worry about the reason for doing this, because quite often what we encounter is this point that slavery within the industrial world was grounded on a perspective of humanity, I guess, which provided these different categories of what type of a biological being you are. And we don't see that in antiquity. But importantly, like, we don't see that across the board. Like, this isn't just special to the Bible. This is a very common perspective throughout the ancient Near East. And this wasn't, it's a strange flex when you actually get into the text, because this was not preventing anyone from either capturing, buying, and owning their own slaves, or falling into slavery. Maybe the strongest difference is that in theory, in the ancient world, because everybody was this, in theory, everyone was the same. We're all part of the human race. In theory, the biggest difference was that anyone could have been a slave. It didn't matter to your skin type or to your ethnicity. Although much of the slavery as is presented in the Hebrew Bible is based on ethnicities, the point is you're either a slave or you're the one enslaving. That's the big difference. But you could be on either side of that same coin, regardless of your skin color or where you came from.
Yeah, I think he's trying to say too that like the transatlantic slave trade was somehow worse because it was race based, but
Yeah.
as you already pointed out, there was an ethnic based slavery too. When you went to war with another country or you had another country around you that you purchased slaves from, we already read in Leviticus 25, there are ways you treat your foreign Hebrew people and ways that you treat non-Hebrew people. That is ethnic based differentiation of rules, and you're harsh on one and not as harsh on the other. And Christianity never actually fixed this. If you read any of the material from the transatlantic slave trade from Christian preachers or from people that were prominent and influential, they go in and say the same type of rhetoric. Like, these people are less. Here's the biblical passages to demonstrate that these people are not as good as the Christians. They're somehow not as developed as the modern Christian man. And so they need to be subjugated.
And look, I'm going to say it again because I think it's important to remember this. If the only point here is to say, when we do our translation, we need to be careful that every time we see Eved, we don't think chattel slave. Okay, but what it feels like to me is like we're that defense attorney here, right? And we're trying to distance our serial killer defendant from the what people hear when they hear serial killer. They hear Jeffrey Dahmer. And so if the defense attorney were saying, hey, look, I know that when you hear serial killer, you're thinking of like really, really grotesque and awful things, like stuff I don't even want to say here. But listen, when what my client is, yes, he went on a spree and killed 35 people, right? So, but I, one size does not fit all here. So like when we talk about, this, just make sure you keep those distinctions in mind. I mean, I think people in the jury would be like, okay, I mean, we'll have a nice nuanced view of his murder of 35 people. Is there some special term you want to use when we talk about it? That's fine. But see, what I think they're trying to do is say he's not Jeffrey Dahmer. Therefore, let's move past this, is how this feels. Right.
Yep. That's exactly where they're at. They're saying it's not as bad as X. Let's just move on and get away from the uncomfortable material and talk about the stuff that's more comfortable.
Greeks did have a similar way, though, of viewing people that they enslaved as chattel slaves. And that is that, Aristotle makes this argument that if you've been a conquered people, you are a lesser people, and that you are the poor man's ox. In other words, like you can be worked like a farm animal.
Yeah, I mean,
Isn't
I think
that
the
exactly
idea
what
of
they
intrinsic
said,
value
right?
that all humans have.
Yes.
The whole point of, well, they're war captives. They're war. So if you go to war, I mean,
But it feels like they're gearing up to an excuse here.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's coming.
Well, this ought to be rich.
Equality by nature being humans, that wasn't something the ancient world looked on as a given anyways. So I don't think we should be surprised when we see Aristotle or other individuals from, say, either the ancient Near Eastern world or the Greco-Roman world saying things like this, because they actually did have a hierarchy of worth. In fact, Roman citizens who were male were seen as having more worth than Roman citizens who were female, and then Roman citizens who weren't, females who weren't Roman citizens, and then even children. So we see a hierarchy anyways, and yeah, there's this kind of breakdown. I think what's different, though, is when we look at something like antebellum slavery or the
So to be sure, that breakdown exists in the Bible too. There is a household code in the New Testament
Mhm.
that makes a differentiation between men at the top, then their wives, and then children and slaves at the bottom of the structure. That's not like something that's just exists outside of the Bible. That is, in fact, God's plan.
And I mean, sorry, but if you read Exodus 21, 28 to 32, if an ox who is known to gore through the negligence of the owner of the ox gores a free person, either a free man or a free woman or a free son or daughter, then that owner's life is forfeit. But verse 32, if the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall pay to the slave owner 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned.
Right.
I mean,
So
is this thing on? Like, I don't like this is property law, folks.
right. So the slave, to be clear, does not have the same value as the free person in the Bible, not just in the ancient Near East. The Bible agrees with this notion that not everyone is on the same social hierarchy as everybody else.
And why is it that lex talionis applies earlier in the chapter when a woman who is pregnant has damage done to her, and yet when it moves on to verse 26 and 27, the eye or the tooth of the slave is put out, they're not due lex talionis. In other words, they don't get the right to the master's eye. They don't get the right to the master's tooth as a free person would. Instead, their payment is set, right? They get to be released. So, why is it that we don't have lex talionis applying for the slave here? These are questions that I think apologists need to deal with.
And this idea of hierarchy existed within Christendom even up until the Civil War and post-Civil War. Jefferson Davis, in one of his speeches, chastising the abolitionists about where they get their moral compass from, says, "What then is their standard? The good of mankind? Is that seen in the diminished resources of the country? Is that seen in the diminished comfort of the world? Or is not the reverse exhibited? Is it the cause of Christianity? It cannot be, for servitude is the only agency through which Christianity has reached the degraded race, the only means by which they have been civilized and elevated." And this wasn't just a view of one man. In the Texas Declaration of Secession says that in this free government, all white men are of right, ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights, that are the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as recognized by all Christian nations. So at some point, you have to eat it. The Bible justifies this level of hierarchical nature of humankind, some as servants and some as not servants.
The slavery within, the American South. What we're seeing is something that's largely wrapped up in discussions of ethnicity and race and skin color. And I don't think we see that same thing going on in the ancient world. They wouldn't have had the same types of categories. They would have understood different groups, like we see Paul talking about in Christ there is no Jew nor Greek. And then he also says barbarian and Scythian. And so he breaks apart these categories of peoples, but they wouldn't have thought of these peoples as lesser because of, say, their skin color or their race and ethnicity. Those kind of concepts are modern ones more than their ancient ones. And that's where I think I agree with you, Andy, that we do see examples of dehumanization, but not in the same ways as we see them being described within the transatlantic slave trade.
So what does that get you? I don't understand the argument there. So what?
Right. It doesn't matter. It means nothing. The question is, does the Bible endorse slavery? And they're saying yes, but it's not race-based. Who cares?
Yeah, listen, we're going to discriminate against this group of people because they wear rainbow bow ties.
Right? I'll allow it. Yeah.
That's why we're going to do that. Anybody that has a rainbow bow tie, we're going to discriminate against them. But listen, I mean, gosh, it's not like we're discriminating because of hair color or something. I mean, that would be crazy. Like, what?
It's really just a less nuanced whataboutism. That's really
Mhm.
what's happening here.
And say, within Scripture, it's pertinent to say, and I know we've talked about this before, and you've mentioned it on the podcast, I think, as well, Andy, is that in Scripture there are things that are allowed within certain contexts, but aren't necessarily approved of. And that's important for this conversation to interpret these types of topics in light of Scripture as a whole. So the one I know we've talked about before is Jesus himself saying that Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of one's heart.
Oh,
But that was
God.
not the way from the beginning in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8.
Right.
In
Can we
other words,
just
everything in
pause
the
it?
law is not an approved.
Yeah,
So-
there's a lot to say about this.
So look, if you're going to come to the text and say something in the New Testament is going to speak to the direct historical, critical, or historical grammatical context or whatever of something in the Old Testament, then you've got to put that on the table, right? And maybe they just assume we're thinking that about them. But just because Jesus makes a statement in Matthew 19 about something in Deuteronomy 24 doesn't mean that that was in Deuteronomy 24 or that we can read that back into it. That's number one, right? You're just applying your theological lens. So as long as we're owning that, fine. But the problem here, it is twofold. One, Jesus doesn't say that divorce is wrong in Matthew 19.
Nope.
He says, yeah, okay. I mean, look, if there's like for this reason, for like fornication, then yeah, I mean, divorce. But if it's anything else, so what's the flex here? Even if you can, which is the second problem, but even if you could somehow tie this to slavery in the Hebrew Bible, doesn't that just mean that you can do slavery? It's not that it's wrong. You just got to do it in the right circumstances. Is that what you want to say? I don't understand.
That's the argument. He hasn't thought through the argument. So this is if you ever wondered, like, do like Bible scholars have better apologetics than non-Bible scholars? Like the arguments we're hearing on like TikTok and YouTube, they don't have better arguments. And what he's about to say is a really bad apologetic. Well, like this wasn't God's initial plan for humanity. This is like an interim plan. Like he's going to change it later. But the problem is every inkling we have about the law that's given in the Old Testament is that this is forever. Deuteronomy 11:1, you shall love the Lord your God, therefore, and keep his charge, his decrees, his ordinances, and his commandments always. He doesn't say for now. He didn't say until I give you new laws. He says do it always. And even in Leviticus, he says, drink no wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. And then this phrase, throughout your generation, gets brought up over and over again for all the laws God is giving. When your future children ask you, what are the meaning of these laws? Tell them these are the meanings of the laws. If you follow these laws forever, I will make sure there is always a king on the throne. And so we have this idea from the lawgiver that this is forever. And in Deuteronomy, you already know at the end of the book, chapter 30 and 31, there's instructions on write these on stone tablets, read them to the congregation every 7 years. Every time there's a new king, make sure the new king has their own copy of the laws, and do this throughout the generations. We have no indication from the Old Testament that any of these laws are temporary, certainly not the slave laws.
Coming back to Matthew 19 for a minute, I'd be remiss to point out that apologists are really excited about this text when it comes to encountering anything that they really don't like from the Old Testament, but then they stop reading and they don't actually read through the text to the end of Jesus's statements regarding sexuality, because my suspicion is that they're less excited about that part.
I think you're making a big
Yeah.
assumption that they read any of it, Kip.
Right. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Interestingly enough, people in the church seem to be quite okay with marrying divorced women, don't they?
They do, but let's keep reading, shall we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're not under law.
No.
Oh, that's right.
We're under grace.
Which That's right. If we're not under the law, we can have as many slaves as we want, because according to apologists, the laws of the Old Testament were to restrict slavery, but those restrictions are gone now. I can have as many as we want.
Mm-hmm.
The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man and his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those whom it is given." Which is identical to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It is better to remain unmarried because the present form of the world is about to end. But they don't like those words of Jesus. Certainly not.
Well, you missed the best part, Justin.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're one of these, Justin. You just stop reading.
Oh, I apologize. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So
If you can, maybe you should be a eunuch for the
you know
kingdom
what?
of heaven.
I'll pray about it. I'll let you know when I get an answer.
I mean, I'll bet many of the people that are making these arguments are incels. I mean, it's just the next step.
Right.
It's just the next
Sorry.
While we're in Matthew, I mean, we would be remiss if we did not also mention that Jesus himself endorsed the laws of Moses.
Yeah.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. And heaven and earth has not passed away, which is why he says, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So at a bare minimum, you have to assume that Jesus thinks doing the law of Moses makes you righteous, because that's what the book says. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, he literally says that you will do well, you and your children after you forever, if you follow these laws. You'll be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. Let's hear the rest of the apologetics.
As much as it's an allowance. So let me say that again. Everything in law is not an approval as much as it's an allowance. And that might be a hard distinction to wrap our heads around, but I think it's an important one, because we see things like polygamy and divorce and slavery happening in the narrative of Scripture.
But we could even do like concubines, for example.
Totally. Yeah. And I would include those under sort of the polygamy conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that those are clear examples of brokenness in circumstances and individuals. Like, those are never framed in a positive light. Slavery, polygamy, concubines, divorce, these are never framed.
Well, that's a lie.
But yeah. I mean,
Isaiah 14 clearly.
Yeah. No,
Sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry. No, you got it.
I mean, Isaiah 14 clearly paints this idea like it's a good thing to own slaves. In fact, that's what God is going to do for you after the Babylonian captivity. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. And aliens will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the nations will take them and bring them to their place. And the house of Israel will possess the nations as male and female slaves in the Lord's land. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppress them. This is a vision of good things to come in the future.
Yeah, but that's not real, because that's war.
Oh, right, of course.
So that's cool. That's cool.
Oh, thinkers here.
That's the good kind of slavery, guys, is when the nations serve you and you possess them. Yeah, Thinker is with us. Good to see you in the house, Thinker.
Yeah.
Let's hear what Wes has got. Again, we still have. He's going to beat this horse a little bit dead, but he's on this idea that God allowed it, but this wasn't actually what he wanted, which is not actually in the text. And the only reason why you can do it with divorce is because if you go to Malachi, theoretically God says, I hate divorce. And so Jesus is drawing this distinction. It seems like God is changing his mind. Therefore, we can apply this rule to everything, to the apologists. Well, if God didn't want divorce to happen from the beginning, then, well, he doesn't want any of these things to happen from the beginning. But how do we pick and choose which laws we determine God didn't want? We're just applying our own ethic to God now.
Positively, even though, say, the Levitical law allows allowances for some of these things.
Let me highlight that, Wes. When we're saying positively, what we're saying is, it's not like there's a command where God's saying in the Bible, look, slavery is good, and I am thankful for slavery, and I have established slavery on
this is a good gift.
Yeah, this is a good gift from the Lord sort of idea. You do not find that, but you do find passages like Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25, where you will see slavery outlined and the allowance of slavery, and quite frankly, things that we would be appalled by, that the Israelites participated in. And I want to get into that because one thing I want listeners to hear is I'm not, nor are we trying to sugarcoat slavery in the Bible. It is wicked, and it is not as Wes is getting at, as we've talked about.
Doing a fine job.
But the Bible does say that God blessed Abraham with many slaves.
He did.
And did I hear him? He said that the slavery in those 3 passages was wicked.
Yeah.
So
he said it.
So thus says Yahweh, tell the people this.
Yeah. This bad thing.
So God can do that with wicked things?
Yeah. I mean, Ezekiel chapter 20 does say that God gave them laws that were not good.
Right, but I mean, like, I don't think they want to bite that bullet.
I hope, yeah, probably not.
So I think what they're attempting to do here is they're admitting that yes, there are actual laws here that were bad, but God allowed it. He didn't want it. He just allowed it. But the nonsense apologetic here assumes that God couldn't have just said what he wanted. What was preventing him from saying it?
What mechanism are these guys employing to make this determination? You know, which are the ones that God, you know, didn't like but made allowances for? Which are those laws, and how do we know those ones distinct from the ones that were really serious?
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
like,
What are you guys
don't bear
doing?
false witness. So that bearing false witness, I guess, if we're ranking this, is something that God can step up to the plate and say, look, don't do this. Right. But then on people's property, man, they're going to do it anyway, and everybody else is doing it. So, like, you know, let me just step them. I mean, what's the methodology here? What's the methodology?
The methodology is the laws that God gave that were just allowances, things that he didn't actually want you to do, but he allowed you to do. Those are the laws that we don't like. The laws that we do like, those have to be permanent. Hating on homosexuals, permanent law, absolutely.
Justin.
Adultery, permanent laws.
Justin, are you suggesting that these gentlemen are forging a god in their own image?
I would never do such a thing. Oh boy.
With Matthew 19 and elsewhere, it was not the way the world was meant to be. This was not the good world that God created. It's the broken world that we've brought. And that's why I think it's so absolutely vitally important that we understand slavery within the context of the biblical arc from Old Testament to New, or else slavery doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I think that's part of why, when you look at Joseph's story, why Joseph's story has so much extra weight to it is because his family, his brothers, sold him into slavery. But as we've been saying, because slavery was seen different in the Old Testament versus the way we look, say, transatlantic, you wouldn't have seen a slave in the transatlantic go from the position we saw Joseph in to being the right-hand man overseeing all of the land, right? You would never have seen that.
That's just not true. Did he never read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Like there were slaves that were elevated in households.
It's probably important to point out, though, too, that this is not something that happened to everyone in the ancient world either.
Right. Why is it such a noteworthy story? It's because of the how rare such a thing would have been.
It's like, oh my God, could you imagine?
Can you imagine?
Look at this thing that happened to Joseph. Unbelievable.
Well, it also assumes that the story's true, by the way.
Now, come on, Justin. Come on. Baby steps. Baby steps.
My bad. I got ahead of myself there, right? Of course, it's obviously true that the real person named Joseph existed and his brothers were mad at him because he had the most badass coat of all time. I get it.
But it's still, there's such a sting there as you see the unpacking of scripture for the interaction that Joseph has with his brothers, and why the arc that is happening there is Joseph's forgiveness. That's where all the power is in that story.
let's just highlight that real quick. And I know you want to say something here, Wes, but let's just highlight this for people that don't appreciate how significant Joseph's story is. You have Joseph who talks about his brothers and wider family bowing before him, and this ultimately, and you have to remember the Old Testament is always these miracles pointing to a bigger miracle. It's always this foreshadowing of what's going to come. So as we'll get to in a bit, I think it's interesting that Jesus' father's name is Joseph.
Yeah.
And what you have is Joseph that goes into, he's sold into slavery. As we talked about, that's a form of slavery that exists in a common form. And then he ultimately is freed, and serves within Pharaoh's house. But ultimately, his people, the Hebrews, become enslaved in Egypt. And so you have to appreciate, this is the irony of this whole thing, is that the Israelites understood themselves as a slave people. And that they were the people that Yahweh freed, and that they were a freed people. So it's like they lifted up that freedom was the ideal, that slavery is bad, freedom is good. And then the irony is,
yeah, they knew it. They knew that slavery was bad, which is why God said you can do the bad thing. So did they know, or did they not? So the apologetic they gave just a minute ago was God was slowly, incrementally moving them out. There's arc, right?
Yeah.
But here we're told that they did know. They were aware that slavery was bad. So nothing was preventing them from saying, hey, let's not do this.
And he commands them to not do it in Leviticus 25 to their own people.
Exactly.
And this is the problem that I think, again, whether it's equivocation or just sort of emerging ideas, I think it falls into roughly the same category in their mindset, at least generally speaking, as like charging interest on a loan. This is something that you'd read Ezekiel, you'll see very clearly. This is a bad thing to do, right? But where is it? Exodus 22. I think that's where it's at. Don't quote me. But it's like you can charge interest to the foreigner, to the Nochri, right?
Right.
So don't do it to your fellow Israelites, but you can do it to the foreigner. So in the same way that it's not good in the sense of beneficial, something a state that you want, right? It's not good to have interest charged to you on a loan. So that means you shouldn't do it to fellow Israelites because that's not a beneficial thing for your own people, but you can charge it to the foreigner. So I don't think the way that they're viewing this, I think, I don't know, it's just showing their cards as to maybe a mixing of categories here.
Right. All right, let's listen on here. It's going to get worse from here, guys.
Yeah, you stole my point. That's exactly what I was going to say. But yeah, I think because we need to understand that it's often when people pick on these things, they go to, say, the Mosaic Law, right? In Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and they talk about these laws that are situated around slavery. But the ancient Israel's own theological and legal attitude to slavery was linked to that essential part of their own history that you just mentioned, Andy. That as you read through the rest of the Old Testament, it's pretty clear that the Israelites never forgot their captivity in Egypt.
Right.
And the whole saga.
So they needed it? Is that the apologetic? Is they needed the slavery so that they would remember later that it's bad to be a slave?
Maybe that's it. Maybe it was just a strong reminder.
Yeah.
But I'll remind people again here. The kind of freedom that is lionized within the text of the Hebrew Bible as the basis for Yahweh's act in Yahweh's acts in the Exodus, his deliverance of the people from Egypt. Again, it's not exactly as these guys are putting it. Yahweh's just taking back what's his. That's the point. Israel, the sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob, it's not, the problem is not that they're slaves and Egypt's bad for owning slaves. Look how terrible Egypt is for owning slaves. We got to get all the slaves out. That's not the issue. The issue is that Egypt overstepped and inappropriately enslaved free people living in their land. And as a result of that, Yahweh's just taking back what's rightfully his. this is what this story is about. And so when this is constantly recalled, it's usually within the context of how you're supposed to treat foreigners and other people living in your land. Don't be like the Egyptians and inappropriately enslave the wrong people, is the message.
Right. Yeah, because we see over and over in the scripture that Israel is God's possession. Famously Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 says that the Lord's allotment is his people Jacob and his special possession. It's not a romantic relationship. They are slaves of Yahweh.
And I just looked it up. So Exodus 22 does say not to charge interest to your fellow countrymen, but it's Deuteronomy 23 that has don't charge your fellow Israelites, but you may charge it to the foreigner.
Yep. And there's another law similar to that talking about exacting debt from your neighbor versus a foreigner. If it's your neighbor Hebrew Israelite, you can exact that debt from them. You
I think
can't
that's
do it
Deuteronomy
to foreigner.
15. Yeah, the first
Oh,
part
okay.
of Deuteronomy 15.
Yeah. All right, let's hear more from the apologists.
Within their own kind of origin story, if you want to call it that, is this frequent and common theme that their whole identity as a people group was linked to them being former slaves. Yeah. And even the Ten Commandments start as their preface. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 and 2 says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." That's how the Ten Commandments start, right? And then it goes on to the covenantal code. And so in both Exodus and Deuteronomy, you see this refrain to not oppress the alien because you yourselves know what it feels like to be an alien because you were aliens in Egypt. And so I often feel like people pick on the Levitical law, the Mosaic covenant, and talk about, look at all the slavery going on, and forget to zoom out and actually look at the context that, in fact, when you ignore that, what you ignore is actually the frame that picture is sitting in.
Yeah.
That this
Right. I mean, look, people do
fact,
this all the time with Babylonian and Assyrian laws, right? It really frustrates me, right? Because, sure, they read the laws of Hammurabi, 115 and 117, or they look through, they comb through these 282 laws, and they're looking for all the laws about talking about slavery, and it's so terrible, but they don't back out and look at the framework where Hammurabi is there to set aright this any oppression of the weak and the poor, right? He's doing away with enmity and calls for justice, doing away with the violence. No, he's there to keep people from being oppressed. And when they just focus and they narrow in and pick on the slave laws, they're just not seeing the broader framework, right? And it really frustrates me.
Right. And for anyone, like, the Code of Hammurabi is free online. You can read the preamble for free, won't cost you a dime. Most of the ancient Near Eastern law codes are online as well. So I'll be making those more public as time allows, but I got to be careful not to get like a copyright infringement.
Well, there's a book out, kind of has all the ancient
It's
Near
almost
Eastern laws about
almost like
slavery
a
in it.
scholar wrote a book called "Does the Old Testament Support Slavery?" Have you heard of this?
Is this a David Falk book?
Oh, it must be David Falk. It's definitely a David Falk book.
Wait, you know what? I think
Do you have it there? Do you have it there, Josh? Oh,
Yeah.
look, it's right behind you.
I just can't remember the author. Some moron, Joshua Bowen. I don't know who that is, but yeah,
Never heard of him.
And
Never.
it's updated and expanded too.
Yes.
Yeah. So the guy who literally wrote the book on slavery in the Bible in the ancient Near East is here with us. So,
But I hear
I know
he
that's the
committed
thing
an
you want to be
atrocity
known
by
for.
shaving his beard several weeks ago. So I don't know if you can trust that guy.
It's coming back. Don't worry. You're almost to
Coming
your
back.
full Samson strength.
needs to be kept in perspective that the Israelites themselves were slaves, and it's inherent to their identity as a nation that the whole narrative of what happened in Egypt took place in regards to who they are.
Now, just to highlight that, the entire Bible is, the whole thing from beginning to end is about slavery and about being freed from slavery.
Yes.
The whole thing. So you start with God creates a good world. They're not enslaved, but then they break that good relationship with God and they become enslaved to sin and evil.
Wow.
I'm
And
sorry.
then
What's that?
Wow.
What's
Yeah.
that? God creates a good world. and they're not in slavery.
Yeah, they're definitely not there as oblates.
If you, I mean, Genesis, do you have it there? Justice, Genesis chapter 2.
Yeah, it says Adam
verse-
was made to serve. Right?
Look, you're
It-
taking that out of context, right? Satan has blinded your eyes.
Of
God,
course.
Yahweh God,
Mhm.
he creates a garden for himself in Eden, and he takes the man and he puts him in the garden
Two.
to look after it, to keep it, and he needs help.
Yep.
And then a whole bunch of weird shit happens as a result. Yeah. So, is it Bruce Wells?
Yeah.
Has
It will
written
eventually
about
come
this?
out.
Yeah.
His monograph will come out.
Yeah. But this is this.
It's all about the mission.
I'll just point out here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm too tired to laugh at all the jokes tonight. I just want to point out here that the word used there is the verbal form of the noun eved, slave, in
Right.
in Hebrew, where it talks about Adam's service
Yep.
to Yahweh.
Yeah. So it says the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to. Now this is where your translator is obfuscating the passage. It says to tend and to keep it, but it doesn't actually say that in the original language. It uses the same root word, eved, or
To slave it,
avad, to slave.
to be
Yeah.
enslaved to it. And it's kind of interesting too the way this story ends. That deed of ownership basically transfers from Yahweh to the ground. It says in at the end of Genesis chapter 3 that the man is to be enslaved to the earth. So you know, it's not like he's now become a slave. It's that he's now just a slave to something other than Yahweh in his garden.
Right.
And in evil, you kind of see as we, Jesus talks about how a little bit of leaven works its way
Only
throughout the
these
whole,
guys
that,
would read
that
their
wickedness
Bibles.
works its way.
Really?
Asking way too much.
I mean, this is why we're here, right? We're here to help. We're here to help you guys. Read your Bible
out through the whole, and we see that in the history of brokenness, and that just leads to all sorts of of slavery. But it's always pointing back to this first kind of slavery that's causing everything else, right? Where we've got they're enslaved to Egypt, they're enslaved to the Assyrians, to the Babylonians, to the Persians, to the Greeks, to the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and then in the New Testament to the Romans. The entire thing, all the books are wrapped around the idea of slavery bad, freedom good, God come and free us. And then the irony, of course, is, as Wes is pointing out, but then you're enslaving people. And this is like, take Leviticus 25 as an example. He says, God says to them in verse 42, because the Israelites are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Don't rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. In other words,
wait, he almost could have just kept reading the passage where he said you can own slaves.
Nah, fam, can't do that.
Could you imagine giving a whole 1 hour video talking about biblical slavery and not actually reading the passages that command slavery? It's unbelievable.
No.
It's the
Well,
height of
I can't.
I mean, it's
lying
not
to
a
your
choice.
audience.
It's not a choice I would have made, but here we are.
They're taking this in a different stylistic direction.
This is
it's like you didn't like being a slave,
Right.
so don't enslave other people. Now, I wish it was cleaner than that. I really do. But the Old Testament allowed them to enslave other people, and the Jews, the Hebrews, there were more regulations around enslaving their own people than foreigners.
Right.
And
Citation
that
needed, please.
Yeah, again, they say things about the Bible, but they refuse to read you the citation.
again,
but again,
it's not the way that it was meant.
hold on though. But okay, so what? Like, is that good? Is it good that there's more regulations around it, even if this is true? Is it good that there's more regulations around enslaving your own people than people who don't belong to the same ethnic group as you? Because I don't know. I kind of think this is why we have unions, right? Because if there's not regulations and people to keep companies accountable, if there's not rules, lots and lots of red tape and rules in place, people are going to take advantage of that, right? So I don't know if it's such a great thing that there's less rules in place for.
And how many counterexamples do you need in order for this theory
Yes.
to go out the window? Right. And we've said this, Kip and I have said this on any number of occasions. If your argument is that God's trying to move them out of slavery, and so what he does is he says, all right, I'm going to allow it. Right. But if the regulations on the other nations are a 6, right, every regulation that I give, I'm going to make it a 7 or an 8. I'm going to make it just a little bit better. I can't tell you not to do it for whatever reason. But I'm either going to keep the law as strict in favor of the slave, or I'm going to make it just a little bit more stringent to protect the slave even more, right? How many counterexamples do you need where the law protects the slave less for that theory to go out the window? Because if, like, I don't know that I've had a good answer to that question, because as you pointed out, right, in 117, Laws of Hammurabi 117, you know, 1,000 years earlier, all right, let's just go by their lights, 300 years, 400 years earlier, Hammurabi's laws said you can only keep a debt slave for 3 years. You have to release him in the 4th. So is it better to serve as a debt slave for longer to work off your debt? Like, that's the argument I think you're going to have to make. Or you're going to have to say, yeah, why would God, you'd have to deal with the question is, why would God, you know, make a law worse for the slave if he's trying to work them out of it by making stronger regulations? Why would he do that?
Right.
I don't know.
And we find this in a number of ancient Near Eastern laws. There's this idea of like temporary slaves should be for 3 years. Hittite laws, number 135 says, if an overseer or a shepherd elopes with a free woman and he does not bring the bride price for her, then she becomes a slave for how long? For only 3 years. And we have, as already mentioned, Hammurabi 117, if debt overtakes a man and he sells his wife, son or daughter, or gives them over to slavery, 3 years in the house of their buyer and master they shall serve. So like we already have a precedent in the ancient world for 3 years. If God is trying to incrementally bring them out of the social norms, he failed. He went backwards.
It's not good.
Yeah.
It's bad.
Yeah. And I do think this plays into like an interesting law that we find in Deuteronomy 23, that runaway slaves of other nations could actually seek asylum in Israel.
Yeah, that's how it's so complicated, right? You're like,
Yeah, it's not as tidy as we want it to be. And in fact, that text explicitly says that a runaway slave, far from being punished or sent back, was to be given freedom in a residence in a village of his choice. And so every other law code that we read during the
There's a lot to say about this. Who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, this isn't. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was because you've done the work on this, but I think let's just start by pointing out that scholars have pointed to this text as something that is legitimately different from what appears. You know, like it's definitely something that scholars have wrestled with. But Josh knows.
Yeah,
this
I mean,
stuff.
I think the problem with the passage, it's sort of like saying, well, you know, the word selem in Genesis 2, we've always translated this as rib, but I mean, like everywhere else that we see it in the Hebrew Bible, it means side, like side of a building or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it must mean side here. Well, I mean, Or maybe you just don't have any like medical texts in the Hebrew Bible that are describing ribs, right? Because that's where you see that stuff in Akkadian, right? So Talmu shows up all over the place as rib. Maybe it's because you have medical texts that talk about it, right? So it's just not in a context in which you would see it. So with that being said, what's being described, and I think Wes sees that, is like this is not just any slave that runs away.
Right.
This is a foreign slave who is escaping from a foreign land into Israel. And the approach, Sam Gringus has a really good section on this in his book on Old Testament laws. Can't remember the title of it. Sorry. But, you know, essentially the people are to take a hands-off approach. They're just supposed to let them be. Right? Wherever they want to, whatever gate of yours they want to settle in, they can go for it. They're not to be returned to their master in the foreign land. Now, the reason for this, as I think most scholars adhere to this, is that this would be a sign of a parity treaty. And Israel's not to have extradition clauses built into their. If you think about what Deuteronomy 20 sets up, Deuteronomy 20 sets up you wipe out all the people in Canaan. They're done, right? That's your land. You're there. Take care of them. They get out. They die or they get out, right? Whatever way you want to come at that. But then it's these cities that are afar off. You approach them and you say, hey, you can be our vassals, right? And you can live in peace in your city, keep going, doing your thing. But whenever we want corvée labor, yeah, we're going to come and get that from you, right? So you're our vassals. If they put up a fight, then they get emasculated. All the men get killed and the women, the children. I mean, that's what Justin showed you earlier. It become your property. So the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy is centered on Israel being the head, not the tail. They're supposed to be in a position of power over the other nations. One of the signs of a parity treaty is these extradition clauses. And so if your slaves escape to us, you will return them. If ours escape to you, you return them to us, right? So like this is, when they say it's not neat, it's not tidy. Yeah, I mean, this verse does not carry the weight that I think many apologists wanted to carry. And the other thing to point out, and I talk about this in the book, is that there's a fragmentary law in the law code or the laws of Hammurabi. It's number 87, where it's because it's broken, it's unclear what it says, but it seems to indicate that if there is a slave and beating is involved, that he is not to be returned to his master.
Yep. I got that one.
And again, like, oh, you've got it.
Yeah, it's in the gap laws between 65 and 100.
Yep.
If either a male slave or a female slave, then there's a break. They shall return him to his master. If he beats him, they will not return him to his master.
So it's difficult to put weight on that or on that law, right? Because we don't know all the details of it. But like the point is that even without 87, right? Like the point here is that this isn't about the humanity of the slave or something. That's not the point. They're not to be oppressed. That's true. Like that is a thing, and that's a thing throughout. You don't oppress people that are weak. But I just don't see it carrying the weight as anybody, because this is how apologists usually put this out. So I'm really happy that Wes is not doing that. Kudos to him. Right? Recognizing that this is a foreign slave escaping. It's not just any slave can escape and it's done.
But I think the apologetic that most Christians are going to go to, and there's a reason why they bring this up, is they want you to imagine that there is a level of sympathy for slaves. Like if they run away, that it must have been so severe that you should be sympathetic towards the runaway slave. But we don't really find that in the Bible. You've already pointed out the reason why this exists is not because they were sympathetic. It was because they were not to make treaties with the other nations. You shall not make covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in your lands, lest they make you sin against me. The same thing comes later. And what do we find when Israel starts to fall into sin? It's because the kings start making covenants with other nations. So this has nothing to do with the slave being pitied, because we find in 1 Kings 2, Hebrews going to get their runaway slaves. But it happened in the end of 3 years that 2 of Shammai's slaves ran away to King Achish, son of Maacah, son of Gath. When it was told to Shammai, your slaves are in Gath, Shammai rose and saddled his donkey and went to Achish in Gath and searched for his slaves and got his slaves. So this is not, there's no humanity towards runaway slaves in the text. This is all about not making treaties with other countries.
Not only mandated the punishment of runaway slaves, so if you look at something like the Code of Hammurabi or some of these other ancient Near Eastern texts, and that's where I think there's a difference.
Yeah, but see,
right? It's not
that's
perfect, it's not as nice
that's
as clean as we
equivocating.
want it to be.
100%.
Yeah.
That's
Tell us
equivocating.
tell us
I've
about all
lost
that,
it.
Wes.
Yeah.
Notice he won't quote any ancient law code. He doesn't know them. He's never read them. He's repeating talking points.
I mean, they're not quoting the Bible. Why would they start quoting ancient Near Eastern law codes?
of course
there's
not.
a difference. There's a difference between your slave in your land running away, right? And a foreign slave escaping from a foreign land into your land. Those are not equivalent. So you can't quote Deuteronomy 23:15-16, recognizing that it's about foreign slaves coming into Israel, and then say, but look, all these other law collections, have laws where if the slave escapes, they're to be punished, or they're to be marked, or reward is given to people that return them or something. These are different circumstances.
Right. And to be sure, if you have a Hebrew slave and they run away into another country, you're allowed to go retrieve them. When 1 Kings chapter 2 talks about Shammai retrieving his slaves, he retrieved them from the Philistines. Those were not his people. So this has nothing to do with compassion towards your slaves. And we know this to be the case as well, because in Exodus 21, you can beat them so severely that they accidentally die. It says, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. Cool. Because it's a murder. It's a murder of a Hebrew person. But it says, if the slave stands a day or two, there's no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. So if they die a week later, they succumb to their injuries, there's no punishment. You're presumed to be part of an accidental death.
But you have these things where if you compare it, some things are better, some things are analogous, but it also includes severe penalties on anyone who harbored the individual, right? So in these other ancient law codes, whereas Israel's law, on the other hand, not only allowed the freedom of the slave, but commanded his protection, his or her protection, I guess you would say. But this is where it's not simple. We have some of these things that outline those, but then we have others. But I think it goes back to the fact that we have this overarching concept in ethics. Let me just read this quote by Old Testament ethicist D.J.A. Kleins in an article called Social Responsibility in the Old Testament. He says, "It is not extraordinary, not to say amusing, that the one society in the ancient Near East that had a law protecting runaway slaves was that society that traced its origin back to being a group of runaway slaves from Egypt. The point is that Israel has experienced God as the one who is sympathetic to runaway slaves. So this law is not just an ethical or legal principle in defense of human rights, but a reflex of Israel's own religious experience."
You can't say that the God is sympathetic to slaves. You can't say it, because he commands you to make slaves. The vision of the glorification of Israel involves making slaves of the foreigners. That's the vision. All right. Josh, I know you've got a hard 9:30 cutoff. I'm going to keep watching the whole video. I'm going to roast them from beginning to end. But anytime you need to go take care of your schedule, don't worry.
I appreciate it, and I'm
let
sure
us know.
Kip will stay and cook.
Yeah.
A fundamental
we'll see.
characteristic.
It's been a long day, but yeah, I'll certainly hang around for a little bit longer.
biblical ethics. And that's where I think it's important. You know, when we're talking about the meta perspective, we're talking about biblical ethics more broadly. Not necessarily this passage or this passage, but the principle of Scripture as an overarching narrative that you include both the Old and the New Testaments. And it starts with these ideas in the Old Testament, but then really comes to its fruition in what we see in the New Testament.
Right, but I mean,
So
like,
what-
come on, Wes. Like, this isn't you. Pick a lane here,
Mhm.
right? Nobody's saying you can't have your theological framework. Obviously, your theological framework is accounting for these things. I mean, you hear it. Yeah, they're really bad. There was sex slavery. It was wicked, right? But it's your theological framework that's accounting for it. You can't ask the question at the beginning of the stream: did the Hebrew Bible or did the Old Testament like allow slavery, however they or condone it or whatever? Like, that is the question that they ask. Now you're saying back out, you know, like 30,000-foot view, right? Obviously, we know that when we tie all of these bigger principles together, of course, the problem is that the early church seemed to miss that completely, right? Like,
Mhm.
you don't have people going, we should get rid of our slaves, right? Like, that meta narrative was lost on the early church fathers, I guess.
There was, I keep hearing about like one or two.
Is it Gregory of Nyssa?
Greg of Nyssa was, apparently
Not
you
my
know.
field.
You've got some church fathers that had the exact opposite opinion. Ignatius, when he wrote to Polycarp, says, you must not be overbearing in your manner to slaves, whether men or women, but on the other hand, never let them get above themselves. It should be their aim to be better slaves for the glory of God, so that they may earn a richer freedom at his hands, and they are not to set their hearts on gaining their liberty at the church's expense, for then they only become slaves to their own belongings. So there's dozens and dozens of quotes from the early church similar to this idea that Christianity made slavery go away is simply not in the actual text or the history.
Let me highlight that as an example. There's a beautiful passage that highlights this. A couple passages. Jeremiah 34 is a very interesting passage. You have this institution of the freeing of slaves, and particularly this is applying to debt slavery. That slaves are to be released. It's part of this year of Jubilee, where they're not only to be released, but they're to be released and provided for, so that they don't go back into debt. That they can. The ideal is freedom. That people, and you see this discussed, that people should be free.
But freedom for who?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so it's only for Israelites, but let's just move past that really quick.
Right. Like, if we were making apologetic and said, listen, Americans cannot enslave another American, you have to let them free in the 7th year. You wouldn't then go and say, yeah, but because the Americans get to go free in the 7th year, it's okay that we're enslaving the Africans. And they're going to come up with the New Testament apologetic soon enough in the video, where they're trying to say, well, listen, you're supposed to treat your slave a particular way. But no one would ever accept the apology saying, well, it's okay to own African slaves as long as you're nice to them. It's okay to reduce them to property as long as you're good to them. But why are they accepting it about the Bible then?
And then ultimately that you would have freedom taking place. And I should mention, Jeremiah 34 is not talking about this. The Old Testament, you have these other passages, say Leviticus 25, that's talking about this. But in Jeremiah 34, it gets picked up because God's challenging them, saying, this is what you're supposed to do, but this is what you don't do. You actually don't follow this. We don't have anything really to indicate that they did do this, that they released the slaves. In fact, the passage says that this is the one time where they said, we're going to do it. We're going to do what God said, and we're going to release our slaves. And they released them, and then they're like, nah, I changed my mind. And so they went and grabbed their slaves back. And what we see here is a theme that you see throughout the entire Bible, from Old Testament to New Testament, and that is your hearts are hard. Mm-hmm. The idea is freedom, but your heart is hard, and you won't let people free. And so you don't like being enslaved, but yet you're fine with enslaving other people. And you have this condemnation that comes from God. And then this is really interesting when you get to the New Testament, because you have places like Luke chapter 4, where Jesus, we're told, goes to Nazareth. It's on the Sabbath day. He went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stands up to read. He pulls out the Isaiah scroll. And this is one of those moments in Scripture where I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to watch this play out, as he unrolls the scroll, and he goes to Isaiah 61, and he reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight of the blind, and to set the oppressed free." And
set who free? Set who free?
Prisoners. Come on. That's
Did
gotta be.
Did I miss something?
Yeah, didn't you know prisoners were all slaves? Obviously, he's talking about slaves.
Obviously. Oh,
But to be sure, the fact that you could read Luke chapter 4 and Jesus misquoting Isaiah 61 out of context and from a witness we don't have. There's no witness that says recovery of sight to the blind and then the other stuff that Jesus says. But this prophecy in Isaiah 61 is not about any slaves going free. This is about the recovery of the Israelites after the Babylonian captivity. And as we've already recalled in Isaiah, after the recovery from the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites are going to make slaves of the other nations. The
Right.
Israelites are the only ones being set free. In fact, in the same exact verse, if they bothered to read Isaiah 61, it says, strangers will stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners will till your land and dress your vines. That's the vision. It's not freedom for everybody. It's freedom for the Hebrews.
Says to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is that idea of Jubilee. This is this idea of setting the slaves free. And this is an idea that gets picked up in the New Testament with redemption, that we have been redeemed, that we have been bought back, that we have been set free. And Jesus says, in fact, that when the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. In other words, Jesus is saying what you never had the heart to do because of your hard heart. And Jesus challenges them on that hard heart, right? Even as we talked about with Matthew 19.
Jesus never once said, free your slaves. There's not a single instance where Jesus ever said, it is not good to own slaves. You should not own slaves. Not once.
nope.
He does talk
Jesus
about
says, "I'm going-"
slaves, though, right? Like in
This
Luke
is-
17. What
this
does he
is true.
say? What does he
Yes.
say?
I'm about to
Says,
say Luke 17.
Yeah, which of you disciples, having a slave working in the field all day, would say when he came in at night, "Here, sit and eat with me"? Of course, you wouldn't say that. You'd say, "Get in there and make my dinner and wait on me, and then only after I have eaten and drunk, then you may eat and drink." And even after all these things, you wouldn't thank the slave.
That's right.
Oh.
So Jesus talks about slaves as though it's a normal part of culture and is not going anywhere. He's using it as an illustration. So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say you are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done. Jesus had every opportunity to say, do not own slaves. I've come to free the slaves. And he never did it. The best you can do is say, if you squint real close to the text and say that the words mean words that aren't actually there, as long as you change the meaning of the words and quote things without looking at the broader context, then you can kind of get this notion that maybe God wanted to get rid of it. He just couldn't say it.
Justin, it's complex. It's messy. 30,000
Oh,
foot view. Come on.
Of course, yeah. I forgot. God is all powerful, but he's incapable of letting his wishes be known.
For you. I'm going to demonstrate and do what you never could do, and I'm going to free you from the greatest captivity that the world has ever known, that has led to every other captivity, the freedom to sin and evil. And Jesus says that now through him, you will be free.
Now, see,
think it's really
that
important to note
is the
because
most
you're reading-
insidious part of all of this, I think.
Yes.
Because what gets picked up on is that, look, yeah, okay, you might not have your actual freedom, but you've got freedom in Christ, right? And when you can do that to a people group, right, now you can take advantage of them or continue to take advantage of them, because you can say, what's really important? Is it really important that you're actually free? I mean, come on. Like, think about all of the spiritual freedom that you have.
Yeah.
That's
And
not dangerous at all.
The church fathers bring this up as well and talk about how there are some
Ignatius,
people.
The passage you read.
Yeah, the passage
said
I
something
read.
in this vein.
Yep. And Ambrose says slavery, you see, draws a distinction. Some are weak of necessity, though strong of purpose, because that is more beautiful, which is done not of necessity, but willingly. And so he put him, referring to the Esau, he says, put on him the yoke of necessity, and later securing for him the blessing of willing subjection. So the idea is like, if you can make people a slave to God's people, then this is a yoke of necessity, because they get their real freedom by not sinning, by not being slaves to their desires. It's a really nasty apologetic.
As you're reading that, also acknowledging that people that have the questions of, the original question, does the Old Testament or does the Bible promote slavery? You have to remember that abolitionists like Frederick Douglass used the Bible to refute slavery, right? It wouldn't have made any sense for them to be quoting Paul and quoting these passages in the Old Testament if the Bible was then promoting it. And we're talking about,
What,
people that had to
what kind of sense does that make? So what? Like, if they don't quote the passages, it's what you guys are doing right now. Right, you're using text and not quoting the ones about slavery. Like,
how is he failing to point out that the slavers in the Confederate States were quoting the Bible too? Weren't they?
Yeah, but they were wrong, Kip. So,
in fact, I've assembled a short list of Christians who did use the Bible, specifically to make people remain slaves. As we already know, the Southern Baptist Convention, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, Richard Baxter, so on and so forth. And the Southern Baptist Convention formed in order to keep slaves in accordance with what the biblical text says. So, like, you can't just keep framing this as, well, the Bible, Christians worked to free the slaves, obviously, because the Bible is anti-slavery, but you can't quote a single passage in the Bible that's anti-slavery. All you can do is talk around it.
The slave's Bible, passages talking about removing slavery, passages talking about, honoring your fellow man and how scripture sees it. And I think it's just important to note that.
It is, but it gets also into the complicatedness of it all, is that equally you'll have people that use the Bible to promote slavery, like people like Jonathan Edwards that we really look up to. And so I just say that because I could hear somebody going, hey, wait a minute, it's complicated. Sure. Yeah, sadly, and it gets back to that hard heart. Yeah, Wes, you want to say something?
I mean, I think there's a caveat to that because Jonathan Edwards' son was an abolitionist. And so there's clear, you see the consistency in something like Jonathan Edwards' teaching. And although there might have been a blind spot there, Jonathan Edwards' son kind of picked up on that blind spot and said, hey, I think something's gone awry here. There's this great quote from the professor of theology and society at the University of South Wales, Rowan Williams. And he says, if the abolition of slavery had been left to the Enlightenment secularists of the 18th century, we would still be waiting. And I think that's what you're getting to there, Troy, is why is that? Well, because let this sink in. Every movement of abolition of slavery within history has been a Judeo-Christian inspired movement.
Yeah.
The age of Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans, pagan Europe, even smatterings of, if you want to talk about Buddhist and Hindu Eastern articulations of the state of slaves due to their karma as a direct result of actions in a previous life. None of those lend themselves to letting the captives free, right? Where does that come from? It comes from believing that all humanity is created in the image of God. And then exactly what you read there, Andy, with Jesus talking about his ultimate goal to set the captives free. Yeah. There's this great section in
Did he say captives or slaves? He keeps saying captives as those captives are slaves.
Yeah. Listen, don't listen too hard, Justin. Come on. Gosh. You're supposed to just let that go. Just let it go right over you. Let it wash over you.
Listen, I mean, I understand that the viewing public might not be attuned to the shell game he's playing with words, but it's not going to slide here.
In Tom Holland's Dominion, where he talks about that in 1842, when the British Consul General to Morocco sought to press the cause of abolitionism with the leaders in the Muslim world, he requesting a ban on the slave trade in North Africa, he was greeted with basically blank incomprehension. Because it was a matter that the Sultan of, I think it was Morocco, said that slavery is that which on all sects and nations have agreed upon since Adam. And like you said, Andy, it's not to say that Christians in the past...
Since Adam, you catch that? It's almost like he's a Christian. Because only Christians and Muslims talk about Adam.
Not only that, I'd like to point out that the Sultan recognized that there was slavery in the Garden of Eden.
Right. Since Adam.
Haven't argued slavery. We do see Christians arguing for the institution, say, in the southern U.S. However, if you look at the argumentation and the arguments against slavery, they were almost entirely religious and biblical. And the arguments for slavery were a combination of economic, scientific, and pragmatic, with very poor proof texting.
That's a lie. There's entire books that were written on this particular topic. Bible defense of slavery.
Yeah, but that's proof texting, Justin.
Oh,
that falls
under
the
worst kind of proof texting.
The worst kind. The ones that actually get to the historical critical method. Yeah.
Right. This is like a 500-page defense of biblical slavery by an actual reverend, but I'm sure he just wasn't a real Christian.
Yeah.
Look at his name, though. I mean, he had to have been. Did you see that? His name is Josiah Priest.
Right.
When you're bored with a name like that, your lot in life is cast.
It's like
I
when you're
would say
born
so.
Joshua and you become like a model, it's that sort of thing.
Sure.
Right.
The dice have been cast, so kidding. I am going to drop out and then go drop onto my bed, I think.
Totally understandable. Thanks for joining us. I really
You-
appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And
Have a
I hope you
good
guys
night,
have lots of
Dr.
fun
Bowman.
cooking.
And for
Y'all
those
take
who
care.
haven't already got
Hot
Dr.
tikva.
Josh's book, go on Amazon and get it now. They've got it in Kindle format, in print format. Does the Old Testament endorse slavery?
And
Go
if you
grab it.
can't afford it, like if you really seriously, if you can't afford it, email us at digitalhammurabi@gmail.com and we've got like a PDF that we can send out. So, but if you can,
You
like
won't.
sort of our livelihood, but we do want people to have the information. So
You won't make them
All right,
serve
guys.
6 years to get it.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
only three, so it's good. All right, y'all have a
Thank
great
you
night.
so much.
Good night,
Bye.
sir. I should probably say that I can stick around for probably 10 more minutes, but then I'm gonna have to duck as well.
Fair enough. At this point, they're not going to say anything valuable anymore. They're going to move into
Okay.
like they're about to move into the New Testament and like
Oh, good.
tangentially mention some passages that have nothing to do with ending slavery, and they're not going to address the Old Testament slavery ever again. They're done with it now in this video. So the rest of the
Wow.
video, there's not much of anything new that really needs to be addressed. It's just more bad apologetics. So you're not going to miss much.
I'm still waiting for someone to provide some good apologetics. I haven't
not gonna
seen
be
it
it.
yet. It's
Even like the scholarly resources. So like I've got the commentary series from Eugene Carpenter on Exodus. And he was a real biblical scholar. I love the guy, but he makes the same bad arguments for why God allowed slavery as
Yep.
the completely uneducated person, because there's not a good argument for it. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Let's see if they have anything worthwhile to say. The rest of the video, like I said, is mostly them turning to the New Testament
right.
and trying to make a case that somehow God fixes it in the New Testament, but he doesn't.
You do have individuals like Frederick Douglass, who you mentioned, Troy, in the 19th century, who himself was a former slave, who wrote scathing articles about the churches that supported slavery because he said that all men are created and stamped with the likeness of the eternal God.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, Wes. I mean, take Jonathan Edwards as an example. His argument for slavery wasn't really so much about scriptures. It was he couldn't imagine a world without it. He
Right.
literally couldn't imagine a world without slavery.
Yeah, it's
And-
pragmatism.
Yeah, seriously, pragmatism. So I think that is really important. But let me just highlight what you're saying, because this, I think, is absolutely key from all the research I've done. Every time that I saw somebody getting it wrong, okay, maybe they were arguing, say, for slavery or doing something else, they're just getting it wrong, where they were mistreating somebody. I think about like Martin
read
Luther.
Josh's book.
I don't think he has. And they say things like they're getting it wrong. What are they getting wrong?
Right.
What did
It's
they miss?
The bad proof texting, Justin. They're not reading it right.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Example, and the horrendous things he said about Jews. It was never atheists in the culture or the secularists that were rising up going, how dare you say those things, and then coming up with some sort of atheist secular argument that we should not do those. It was always a Christian condemning the other Christian, going, no, brother, you have this wrong.
You got it wrong.
Yeah.
You got
Yeah.
it wrong.
And I would actually argue that the same sort of proper biblical interpretation that gets us to something like the doctrine of the Trinity, looking at scripture as a whole and looking at it
Did you
within
catch
its original
that?
context, grammatically,
the proper biblical interpretation that gets us to something like the Trinity, the non-existent in Scripture Trinity. Somehow there's a secret code to reading the text that gets you to understanding this thing that is never in the Bible. That's what we're supposed to be doing. I'm sorry, but I don't know how to do that.
Right. And he's also suggesting that the Trinitarian doctrine is kind of developed on inference. And he's saying if we use the same type of thinking, we can find passages in the Bible and we can develop a doctrine of anti-slavery based on inference. But
Yeah.
this is not a strong case, because if God wanted something to be known, he could have just said it. But what he did say was the exact opposite of that thing. And so, like in Amos, God says, he doesn't do anything before revealing it to his prophets, the servants. Cool. So if he was going to end slavery, he should have said so. He never said that.
Textually, the same level of interpretation that gets you to the doctrine of the Trinity also gets you to the condemnation of slavery. And that's why we see the people who are arguing against slavery, like Frederick Douglass or William Wilberforce, others, they are arguing on the basis of ethics and theology and from the text of Scripture.
Yeah.
And we could see this, by the way, all the way back in the New Testament with the way that Paul is talking with the Jews and the Gentiles and about what God has done. When we look in Ephesians, for example, that God has broken down that wall of hostility that existed between us, that God has now, he's done away with that. He has now made one humanity. Again, this isn't something new, by the way. This is something old.
That exact same book, what does he say? It says, slaves obey your earthly masters.
Yeah.
And then in verse 9, masters do the same to them, referring to treating them properly. If Paul was against slavery, he should have said, and masters, don't own
Release
slaves
your
anymore.
slaves. Let them go.
Let them go. Let them
Right.
go. Was anything stopping him? These were his people. These were Christian people.
Yeah.
He's not talking to people outside of the church. So this idea that Paul was against slavery, and if you just squint right, you'll find it. It's not actually in the text. The closest you'll ever get is the book of Philemon, which I think they'll mention eventually, but they're not going to actually read from it.
This was in other words, he's restoring it back to the original when we weren't in hostility towards one another, and that we treated each other with equality, right? That we saw the common humanity between us. And these are ideas that you see Jesus picking up on, even when he condemns temple worship, when he says, my house is always meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. Yeah, this was never meant to be something that divides and that leads to the kind of wickedness that the world has always known, sadly. And the problem is when you've been in that wickedness for so long, you can't imagine a world without it. But yet Jesus was calling them to something, he was calling them to return to the original. And that's what Jesus means, like when he's preaching in Matthew 5, when he says, listen, I haven't come to, get rid of the law. I've come to fulfill it.
Yeah.
That this was never meant to be the way that it should be. This was never meant to be, that kind of a.
He's saying the law wasn't the way it was meant to be.
And that when Jesus
saying.
says he fulfills the law, he's saying it's never the way it was meant to be. I mean, does this gentleman understand English?
Nope.
He's just attaching meanings to words that aren't there.
Right. And we already read it.
Yeah.
Jesus says, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. According to Jesus, the laws are good and necessary and right. You can't keep saying that the laws were temporary and that somehow Jesus agrees with this. You don't get an inkling of a temporary law until you look at the writings of Paul.
World, it's meant to be the kind of world that God created in the beginning when we lived in right relationship. And this is where, when Jesus then starts preaching in Matthew 5.
When Adam was an oblate in the Garden of God.
Yeah, exactly. He was made to serve in the garden, and then when he left the garden, he was made to serve even more.
The earth, yes.
6 and 7, he takes the law and he goes a whole step further than more than just about don't murder, but don't even have the desire to murder. You see, this is getting back to the problem, the root problem throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament is you have a hard heart problem. And it's one thing to say all these laws, don't do this, don't do that, right? And don't have slaves. But Jesus is saying, I want you to have the right desires, that you don't want to have slaves, right? Well,
Does he ever say that?
No, he never said it.
Close to that, or we're just inventing things that Jesus said now. That's what we're doing.
This is the state of slavery apologetics. You have to put words in Jesus's mouth.
Yeah, you do.
Which is why we say all the time in the debate spaces, without lies, Christianity dies. Because you have to tell lies to keep this thing going.
Wow.
You don't want to murder. You don't want to commit adultery.
That's right.
Yeah, which is the intention of the law from the beginning, right?
That's right.
That when Jesus says, you've heard it said, he's not critiquing the law. He's going back and pointing out the hypocrisy of groups, particularly like the Pharisees in his day, who were adhering to the letter of the law, but not actually to the intention and the meaning and the understanding of the law.
So,
why are they?
Can I just say something about the hypocrisy of his day, and then pointing to the Pharisees. And this is always troubling to me. This is always really bothersome, and I don't like it. What Wes is doing is he's accepting a jingoistic appraisal of Judaism from the perspective of the New Testament writers, without any, clearly, it seems to me, without any actual grasp on the shape and function of Judaism as it actually was, as we know it from their own sources. And this is very common. Very common within Christian apologetics. And the reason for that is because the only book they're reading is the Bible, is the New Testament, which has this incredibly pejorative stance against, the rest of the Jews of the day. Don't do this, people. It's bad. It's really, really bad.
But that is kind of what you get in the New Testament. It has this anti-Semitic flair to it, and because that's how you justify the New Testament. You have to go and say, well, the Jews got it wrong. And why did they get it wrong? Because they were hard of hearts and they just didn't read their text, and so on and so forth. And there's a really good book that touches on this. It's Jews and Anti-Judaism in the New Testament by Terrence L. Donaldson. Highly recommend it. But Dr. Kip, I totally agree with what you're saying, because like, in order to accept the Christian message, you then have to accept negative stereotypes about the Jewish people.
You kind of do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
These laws about building fences on your roofs. Well, it's not because someone needs to go around with a ruler or meter stick or the equivalent and make sure that, the bylaw officer is keeping everybody in check.
So what they're suggesting here is that Jesus wants you to keep the intention of the law, not the letter of the law. But what is the intention of the law when it says you can own slaves? How do you keep the intention but not the letter?
This is, again, we're back to this is just another spin on accepting the laws that we like as the real ones, and the laws that we don't as simple allowances or as accommodations or things like this. Where's your metric, Wes? What are what is the method here for making these distinctions within the text themselves? Because they're not there. They're not inherent.
Right.
You have to apply something from the outside to them. And maybe on this point, I should probably also
I know it's getting late.
duck out of here, Justin. It's been a long day for me, but I really appreciate coming and hanging out with you tonight. It's been fun.
Hey, thanks so much. Are you doing Hebrew on Thursdays this coming week?
So this Thursday, Josh and I were supposed to, but then I noticed that we both of us actually double booked ourselves. We're going to be on another channel on Thursday night, talking. We're starting. This is going to be fun. We're starting. This is over on. I believe it's on Debate Hub. We're starting to review the fine work of famous biblical scholar Eugene B. Peterson on the Exodus.
Why? Why would you do that to yourself?
I don't know. I don't.
Are you gonna read it from the message?
No, I don't know what's. I've not been involved in the planning on this. Someone said, "Hey, you should show up," and I said, "Okay." So that's what we're doing this Thursday. Ordinarily, it would be Hebrew this Thursday evening, but people are going to have to wait for another couple of weeks. But yeah, so that's But I'll just say this. I'll mention it now. I will be starting my own course in Hebrew on March 4th. It's
exciting.
a Tuesday evening. if you have any interest in the language, if you've ever wanted to learn the language, it's a 10 lecture course, 90-minute lectures once a week. You can sign up at digitalhammurabi.com, and I'll see everyone there, right? Everyone.
Absolutely.
Sign up, right? Space is limited. So, but yeah, we'll sit down again soon though, Justin, and read some more.
Yeah, let me know when. I'll sit down. We'll do some Hebrew together. I don't know what our next narrative is after Balaam.
We're continuing. We're just,
Okay.
and this is the way Josh and I go. We just, we read through a chapter and then we decide where we're going next. So we just don't know at this point. We're in Numbers chapter 23, and we'll see. But
Awesome. So if anyone's not already following Dr. Kip Davis Jr., make sure you're searching that up on YouTube and dropping him a follow. He's got awesome content. And for those who weren't here at the beginning when we did introductions, he's a Dead Sea Scrolls expert. And you've done a lot of work on Jeremiah, correct?
yeah, I have. That was my my PhD dissertation.
Right. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Have a good one.
You too.
All right, we're going to keep rolling. There's about 15 minutes left in the bad apologetics video. I'm going to keep rolling to see if there's anything worth responding to. Most of what he's going to say is now moving into the New Testament nonsense. And so you guys already know what's going to happen with that.
And how many centimeters the fence is on the roof. No, it's because the roofs are flat. People are walking around up there. You don't want someone to fall off. You need to love your brother, love your neighbor as yourself, and make sure that they are safe when you're walking around on your roof. So it's
a shift in the
the
motivations.
yeah, it's the intention. You know what's interesting is I tracked down the first instance of slavery in the Bible. Do either of you have a guess as to when the first
He's about to flub it, guys.
mention of slavery in the Bible is?
I want to say it has to do with Abraham.
Well, I would be thinking Genesis, and I would be.
Is it with Noah? Genesis 9:25?
Yes, that's
When Noah
it.
curses his son Ham.
Nope. And this is how you know that none of these people can read biblical Hebrew, because they think the curse of Ham is the first instance of slavery, but it's actually not. And they don't understand the nuance of the Hebrew language or have familiarity with where words show up in the Hebrew Bible. Again, none of these people have expertise in the ancient Near East or in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, and that Noah's like the curse of Ham is directly related to the subsequent status of Canaan as attributed to the curse of Noah. So slavery.
Keep in mind what he's saying here, guys. He's literally saying that the Bible, he's not going to flesh it out, but in the Noah episode, when Ham is cursed, it's actually Ham's son Canaan is cursed. The entire lineage is cursed to serve the other brother. So God is instituting slavery. He's not going to say it. He's talking about it, but he's not going to come out and say it. The first instance of slavery that at least he's aware of is God commanding people to be slaves. And we'll pull that up here in a second.
Seen throughout Scripture as a natural and fallen and accursed, and in no way an essential and unchangeable part of the nature of things. And that's
In other
why
words, it
I
wasn't
think
meant to be that way.
it totally. And when we turn to the New Testament, we see that, right, with Jesus, but also Paul in 1 Timothy 1 stating that slave trading is unholy, profane, and contrary to the gospel. We see in 1 Corinthians.
We'll address that. So the passage he's referring to says, Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. And he said, cursed be Canaan, which actually wasn't Ham, that's the son of Ham, and a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. So God curses all of the Canaanites. This is the explanation, the initial explanation for why the Canaanites are cursed. The Canaanites are cursed to serve the Israelites, to be slaves of the Israelites because of what their ancestor did many, many hundreds of years ago.
7, an urging of slaves to obtain their freedom, like I mentioned before, if they're able to, and says that no one should choose to become a slave. And then in Greco-Roman society, some people in economic depravity would choose slavery for economic reasons. And Paul specifically says, don't do that. He forbids it. And I mean, one thing that
He didn't forbid it. He did not forbid it. In fact, he explicitly gave rules for what to do while you're in slavery and when you own slaves. He did mention that if you can gain your freedom, it is good to do so. But that is not an endorsement of ending slavery. That's just an acknowledgement that it's better to not be a slave. But we already had that throughout the Bible. The Bible acknowledges that the preferable condition is to not be a slave. which is why it's so horrific that the Bible allows you to make slaves.
Often find is completely lost in this conversation is we have a letter from Paul that's written about a slave
Philemon.
to a
Philemon.
slave master, about a runaway slave. And what does Paul say? He says, take this person as your brother.
Yeah. I was waiting for us to get there. I was like, I know we're talking OT, but Paul lines this up for us perfectly.
Yeah.
I want to highlight actually what he says in there, because again, it lines up with the OT, where he says, and I'll just read for you, verse 8, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do. I love
Yeah.
this. I could order you to do what you ought to do. But what does he want? And I think that this is the theme you see from God. It's the heart thing.
So what he's suggesting here is just a bald-faced lie. He's suggesting that Paul has like a biblical grounds to order them to free the slaves, to order Onesimus to be free. But that's not the case. What he's actually suggesting here is something different than that. It says, for this reason, I am more than bold enough in Christ to command you to do the right thing, yet I would rather appeal to you on the basis of love. He didn't say anything about having a justification based on theological grounds, but actually what is on his grounds as an apostle to Christ. He's using his own authority to make this appeal, not an authority from Scripture, because there is no scriptural appeal to what he's suggesting. And what it seems clear, the reason why he wants this slave to become free, likely because he was abused, but also because he wants him to serve himself. He says, I'm appealing to you for my child, Onesimus, whose father I have become during my imprisonment. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he is indeed useful to you and to me. He wants Onesimus to serve him rather than serving Philemon. And also take note that Philemon probably had multiple slaves. This wasn't his only slave. If Paul was against slavery, he could have said, hey, you shouldn't own the slaves to begin with. Here's the scriptural backing for that. I have the authority of Jesus Christ. Therefore, free Onesimus and free all your other slaves. He didn't say anything like that. He sideways pleads and says, I would prefer you to do the right thing and turn your slave over to me to serve the gospel. This is not an endorsement of getting rid of slaves. As he says elsewhere, he literally says that you need to treat your slaves the proper way. In fact, he says it again in Colossians. I'll bring it up for you here in a second. In Colossians, I believe, chapter 4, he says, masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you have a master in heaven. So he's saying, listen, because you are also slaves, treat your slaves fairly. What he should have said is, you shouldn't own slaves. If that was his intention, was to get rid of slavery, he missed the mark. He didn't do it correctly. He failed.
But yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. And ultimately he says to them, I want you to make the right choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then it continues on from there. It is interesting that we can often miss these key points of what's happening. And if I could just highlight this, in particular, the book of Ezekiel. I've talked about this before in the podcast. It's such an important book in the Old Testament. It is this book that just really highlights the hardness of the human heart, and that we ultimately have the issues in our world today because we're stubborn-hearted. We have this hard heart, and God's saying, man, I need to exchange that hard heart for a heart of flesh. And as he says in Ezekiel, and put my spirit within you, that ultimately that you might desire to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So he's misquoting Ezekiel. This comes from Ezekiel 36, and they always want to quote like the one verse of it, and they ignore the wider context. But you guys know that doesn't fly here. So he says, a new heart I will give you, a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove from your body the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you. Why is he doing all this? He didn't say, I'm going to do it because I want you to do the right thing. He says, to make you follow my statutes. I will put my spirit within you, and I will make you to follow my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances. Because that was the problem. It wasn't that the law was the problem. The law was never the problem. The problem is that they weren't following the law. So even in this era where God is going to put his spirit within the people, the spirit is going to enable people to follow the law, and that law includes slavery. There's not an inkling of Ezekiel 36 that has anything to do with slaves going free, not a single thing.
You might live this out, and ultimately this is what we see in the New Testament is being fulfilled in Jesus, that in Jesus, that hard heart is broken. And if we could just talk about this for a moment, guys, How does God break the hardness of the human heart? I would say that the way that he does that is through his son, that God's son comes into the world, right? Jesus. And what does he come into? He's born into slavery.
Yeah.
Jesus is born into slavery under Roman rule. His father's name's Joseph, as we mentioned earlier, a foreshadowing of somebody that was sold into slavery.
So again, they haven't read the text. There's not a single spot in the New Testament that would lead us to believe that all of the people living in the land of Judea were slaves to the Romans. That's not how things worked. Were they under a burden by the Romans? Of course, they had to pay a heavy tax, obviously, but they had their own governors. In fact, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, we read in Cassius Dio that the Romans, when they finally had enough of the revolt, they made so many Jewish slaves that they didn't have enough buyers for the slaves, which implies that they weren't actually slaves. They were just living under occupation, and there is a difference. If they were already slaves, then there would be no need to find buyers for the new slaves that came from the Bar Kokhba revolt. So again, these people are repeating talking points, but they're not engaging in any actual texts. They're not quoting anything. They're not quote mining anything. They're not even proof texting. They're just repeating talking points, and they're empty talking points.
But that would ultimately be redeemed,
Yeah.
and that God could do good from evil. Evil was done, but God could work good through it. And that ultimately God, through Jesus, takes this wickedness and does good through it, in that Jesus was crucified. That is a slave's punishment.
Yeah.
The worst of the worst died by crucifixion. And that's the punishment that Jesus takes on our place. Why? So that he could fulfill, right? Could restore us back to the original, that he could bring us back into right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. And that ultimately that you and I through Jesus are set free.
Yeah.
And now it breaks that hard heart if we allow it. If we allow that message, it can break your hard heart, give you a heart of flesh, accepting that free gift that God's Holy Spirit now lives in and through you, that you desire the right things because you desire what God desires.
And I think it's important to note, as you see, in the interaction with God and Moses is being instructed to go speak to Pharaoh. What does he say? He's like, well, let my people go and that they might worship me. Right? It is for, scripture says it is for freedom that he has set us free. And that freedom is so that we are free to worship.
Freedom's the good.
Freedom is the good.
Yeah, I mean, so we've already addressed this before, but he's not setting all of the slaves free. This is what people are being dishonest about. Listen, if God was against slavery, he would have freed all the slaves from all of their enslavements. He freed the Israelites. He freed his slaves so that they can be his slaves and not slaves to Egypt. That's why it says in Leviticus 25 that they are my slaves, which I brought out of the land of Egypt. If God was so against slavery, then he could have done all the miracles that he did for his people. He could have done those miracles for other enslaved people, but he didn't do it. God is not concerned with slaves around the world. He has never been in any single part of the Bible. He's only concerned with his special people.
But it's so that we can worship him, right? And I say this to some people when they're talking about, if a person's like, man, I want to be healed. Oh, I want to be this. I'm believing God to do all these things. And you got to start asking yourself, for what? Like, why? I want to be debt free. Why? I want this to stop happening. Why? Right? Because when we look in scripture, any form of freedom, the greatest and highest form of freedom that God could offer us was so that we could worship him with our lives. Yeah. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah, it's about him. I like the way that Glenn Scrivener, a friend of the ministry, when he spoke at our Ontario conference, he described it as the God of the highest highs stepping into the lowest lows so that God our son could become God our brother. And that's really what it's about, right? It's about the fact that God did not have to do what he did and didn't do it in the way that we might think it should be done, but it's because God is God and he knows something that we don't. This is what we see within the reverberations of the implications of this gospel message. When we see something like the abolitionists, and the first instance of history's full-throated argument against slavery was in 380 with Gregory of Nyssa, who was one of the Cappadocian fathers. And he, which is in what is today modern-day Turkey, he ends a sermon that we have recorded by saying this. Let me just read it for us. You condemn man to slavery when his nature is free and possesses free will. You legislate in competition with God, overturning his law and justice for the human species. The one made on the specific terms that he should be the owner of the earth and appointed to government under the Creator. He is the one you bring under the yoke of slavery, as though fighting against the divine decree. By dividing the human species into two with slaves and ownership, you have caused humanity to become enslaved to itself. You be the owner of itself. For what price, tell me, what you have found in existence worth as much as the human nature? What price did you put on rationality? How many coins did you recoin the equivalent to the likeness of God? How much valuable currency did you get for selling the being that was shaped by God? God said, let us make man in our image and likeness. Whenever a human being is for sale, nothing less than the owner of the earth is led into the sale room. Has the scrap of paper that was written on a contract and the counting of the coins deceived you into thinking yourself the owner and master of the image of God? What folly. And that, like, imagine.
Great. Yeah. Quote mining Christians that were against slavery is great. I can do that too. Pope Gregory, in a letter, says, if, however, you find them unwilling to change, meaning the people who are practicing heresies, if they're unwilling to change their ways, we desire you to arrest them with a fervent zeal. If they are slaves, chastise them with blows and torments and bring about their correction. If they are free men, let them be led to penitence by strict confinement. And there are other quotations. Basil talks about slavery and said, men are brought under the yoke of slavery either because they are captured in battle or else they sell themselves into slavery owing to poverty, as the Egyptians became the slaves of Pharaoh. Sometimes, by a wise and inscrutable providence, worthless children are commanded by their father to serve their more intelligent brothers and sisters. Any upright person investigating the circumstances would realize that such situations bring much benefit and are not a sentence of condemnation for those involved. It is better for a man who lacks intelligence and self-control to become another's possession. Governed by his master's intelligence, he will become like a chariot driven by a skilled horseman or a ship with a seasoned sailor at the tiller. So slavery in the early church was not universally agreed upon. All throughout Christian history, there have been people that are pro-slavery in the church and people that are against slavery in the church. Just quote mining some people in the church that had scathing reviews of slavery won't save your bad apologetic. I will quote mine equally the amount of people from the church that say the exact opposite.
I think a sermon like that, right?
Give me a minute.
And what is that? That's the outpouring of the ethics that we've been talking about, Old and New Testament put together, culminating in God who steps out of eternity and into humanity as a slave.
Jeez.
Amen. And I
Amen.
think maybe a good place to end here would be with Galatians 5:1, when Paul reminds us that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free.
Yeah.
Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. That we have been freed from.
That's the yoke of slavery to the law. He's lying to you. This is the problem, is they continually quote things out of context and they just lie to you. So if we just go to Galatians chapter 5, it's 5 or 3. Let me grab it real quick. I think it's chapter 5, he said. We'll pull it up. He's not actually quoting you the whole passage. So if you read the whole passage, it'd be clear that, there we go. Let's 5:1. I'll put it on the screen. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. But what's he actually talking about? Listen, I, Paul, am telling you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. Once again, I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obliged to obey the entire law. You who want to be reckoned as righteous by the law have cut yourselves off from Christ, have fallen away from grace. The yoke of slavery that Paul is referring to is slave to the law. He's not saying that Christ came to free slaves. And if he actually read the whole text of Galatians rather than quote mining or using ChatGPT, you would have actually known this. But again, these apologies for slavery are bad and lazy, and they're lying to your face, hoping you're not going to read the text and you're not going to call them out on it.
Greatest slavery, the slavery that leads to every other slavery, sin and evil, and that when that takes root in us and exchanges that hard heart for a heart of flesh, it leads to Gregory of Nyssa's that are led by the Holy Spirit that condemn the brokenness of this world. And that would, and you know what, and slowly, I don't think, let me just highlight this, by the way. It took a long time to defeat slavery.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, it took a long time. And it's still with us at some level. But that, if anything, I think some people want to go, oh man, they want to look at God and go, oh man, God, you're a moral monster. Look at all this wickedness. And the message of the Bible is,
it took a long time to end slavery because people were using God's own words to make slaves. They had a book of law uttered by God that said to make slaves. That's why it's so hard to end things. That's why it's so hard to move on, because when God himself says you can own slaves, it's very difficult to overturn God's divine laws, God's objective morals. That's why it took so long. Yes, was it a huge form of utility for the slave owners? Obviously. Did they have an incentive to keep the slaves with or without the Bible? Obviously. Would it have been easier to get rid of the slaves if God clearly said don't own slaves? Even if God knew they were going to disobey, if he would have just said it in every chapter that slaves are mentioned, if God said slavery is wrong, slavery is bad, don't own slaves, eventually the Christians and the Jews and the people reading the book would have said, oh, God doesn't want us to own slaves. Then they could have used that text to say, listen, this is the right thing and it's from God. What we have is the opposite. God in the Bible justifying slavery in every chapter. And that's why it was so hard to get rid of slavery.
If you read it correctly, is to go, oh man, the hardness of the human heart.
Yeah.
Instead of is God a moral monster, am I a moral monster? What's going on in here?
And that's why we see, I think, not a direct prohibition, because God doesn't want us to obey rules. He wants to change our hearts. And so he orchestrates the parameters, like we see in the letter of Philemon, where Paul is saying, I could order you to do this as an apostle, but I don't want to do that. And that's where I think we need to, Greg Koukl has this line, never read a Bible verse. And what he means by that is you should always read the context, the narrative, right?
Read the whole thing.
Could you imagine quoting that, saying that the reason why people are getting it wrong is because they're not reading the context and the whole narrative? When these three apologists, three grown men, haven't read a single passage, much less the context of the topic that they're talking about. It's embarrassing that these people are getting up on a public stage and uttering this amount of nonsense.
Don't read a sentence in a novel, read the novel.
Yeah, exactly. And this happened to me when I was talking to Billy Carson, and he brought up slavery in our debate, where he quoted Ephesians 6, slaves obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you obey Christ. Okay, that's verse 5. 6 is obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God for your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know the Lord will reward each one of you whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Okay, then the next part is the most important. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way.
Yeah.
Masters. Master slave owners, treat your slaves fairly, which is exactly what they said in the antebellum South. We're bringing the heathen people to Christianity. We have ways to treat them. You can't just kill your slave. We had slave laws. People don't realize this. We had slave laws on the books. Whether they got followed is a different story, but there were slave laws. So this idea that, fundamentally the Bible is if you just take it in context, isn't actually pro-slavery, it's nonsense. These people are lying to your face, and they're hoping that you're not going to go back and read the book. The book of Ephesians doesn't dissolve slavery. It just codifies it even more than it already was.
Just got to keep reading, guys.
Why? Because it's this whole concept that in Christ there is no male or female, slave or free, Jew nor Greek, barbarian or Scythian. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as gender. There's no such thing as economic status. That there's no such thing as ethnicity. What it means is that we're all on equal footing. And so when Paul is writing to the Christians in Ephesus and saying, hey, slaves, obey your masters as if you were obeying God himself. And hey, masters, you better do the same. Why? Not because these distinctions within society don't exist, but because you understand that you have no right, the Cappadocian Fathers' right. You have no right to say you are of more value than anyone else. And so you better be treating people as if they are an image bearer as well.
That's good.
Funny, none of that was in the book. Not a single word of that is in the Bible. If that was in the Bible, he would have quoted the verse. It's not there. You cannot justify this topic unless you add stuff to the biblical text, put stuff in the mouth of Jesus, put stuff in the mouth of God that is not actually there. Again, these people are lying to your face, hoping you're not going to read the book.
So maybe this would be an interesting place to end on, just ending with a thought experiment for people just to consider, because I think some people might hear this and be like, well, why didn't God just stop slavery from the very beginning? Why didn't he just not allow people to enslave people? And it gets back to this the heart problem. God could stop people from enslaving people, but that doesn't mean that they don't. It's like you could create cars that get.
Did you hear it? Did you hear what he said? He said God could stop people from enslaving others. God could do it. And this is a true thing. If God wanted to end slavery today, he could have ended it. If God wanted to end it 2,000 years ago, he could have ended it. God has the power to do anything he wants. He has the capability to give any laws that he wants. He chose not to. Why did he choose not to? Because slavery wasn't on his radar. He didn't care about slavery. It was more important that you knew where you could put your pee-pee. It was more important to know that you had to be circumcised. It was more important to know that you had to eat the right animals. Don't eat unclean animals. It was more important to know that you can't touch pork and that you must not allow a sorcerer to live and that you can't wear mixed fabrics or plant two seeds in the same field. All of those things were much more important than God just saying, hey, I don't like the slavery. I'm going to put an end to it. Stop owning slaves.
can't speed, but that doesn't mean that people don't still want to speed, right? Or you can create a world where they can't enslave people, but it doesn't mean that they don't want to enslave people. They might, still want to enslave people, but God is now, fencing everything in our lives, and it raises this question: what has to change in my life so that I desire the right things, that I don't want to enslave people? And ultimately, this is the gospel message. This is why you've got to read, as we're saying, from the beginning to the end, and you got.
That's not the gospel message. They haven't read the beginning or the end. There's not a single word in the gospel that says, I want you to desire to not to own slaves. It's not in there. From beginning to end, God is commanding people to make slaves and saying that his vision for his people is for the other nations to serve them. That's the vision. So you can't get away from slavery here. It's never going to happen. That's the end of their video. And it was a 1 hour video. I sped it up to get it down to like 35 minutes. It still took almost 3 hours to get through it. If you guys are not already following Dr. Josh Bowen at Digital Hammurabi, I recommend you do it. If you guys are not following Dr. Kip Davis on his YouTube channel, I highly recommend you do it. If you're not following me, go ahead and drop me a follow. I typically don't do live reaction videos like this, but Dr. Josh and Kip really wanted to do a live reaction video to Wes's nonsense. So we did. And I think, they cut out about the right time. I told them it might go for a while, but be that as it may, if there are other videos, other nonsensical videos that come out like this, I'll be sure to start addressing them in the future. I've had a lot of requests for people asking me to address like various apologist videos. So I'll start doing it more and more, even though I won't quit doing the live streams where we debate people, but I'm going to be addressing some of these bad apologetic videos. And yes, if you're a wannabe scholar, you can cook a guy like Billy Carson. Anyone can cook a Billy Carson. He doesn't know a thing. I want to see Wes Huf debate an actual scholar or even a seminarian like me. Listen, if you really think you have something to say, debate someone who actually knows what's happening. Don't debate some nonsense guy that believes in ancient aliens.